In the summer of 1942, an American general sat in a war room somewhere in the Pacific Theater and asked himself a question that would reshape the entire military strategy of the United States Navy and Army for the next 3 years. The question was deceptively simple. What if we didn't have to fight our way directly across the Pacific Ocean toward Japan, island by island, losing tens of thousands of men on beaches we didn't even need? What if instead we could choose our battles, skip the heavily fortified positions, and draw a careful, diagonal line across that vast expanse of water, taking only the islands that mattered, leaving the others to wither on the vine? If you find yourself drifting off to quiet, detailed stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe. It is the simplest way to make sure the next long journey through the story of Operation Cartwheel, MacArthur's island-hopping blueprint, WW2, finds its way back to you. That general was Douglas MacArthur, and the strategy he was developing would come to be known as Operation Cartwheel, though the term itself was used somewhat loosely by different military planners and historians, and the exact naming and organizational framework of it all remains, even now, a matter of some scholarly interpretation. But the core idea, the island-hopping approach, would become perhaps the most influential tactical innovation of the Pacific War, a strategy so elegant in its economy of force that it still appears in military academies as a masterwork of resource allocation and psychological warfare. Yet curiously, even with all we know today about World War II, there remains a genuine historical puzzle at its heart. How much credit belongs to MacArthur, how much to his naval counterparts, and how much to the accumulated frustration of officers who saw traditional methods leading only to bloodshed? If you're drawn to the forgotten decisions that rewrote history, to the moment when one person's willingness to break with established doctrine changed the course of a war, then I'd encourage you to follow this series on Operation Cartwheel and MacArthur's island-hopping blueprint in World War II, where each stretch explores another layer of how this strategy took shape and what it meant for millions of lives. Now, to understand how we arrive at this moment in 1942, we need to step back and look at the state of the Pacific War as it existed in the first months after Pearl Harbor. Japan had struck in December of 1941, not just at Hawaii, but across Southeast Asia, capturing territory at a speed that stunned the Western powers. The Japanese had taken the Philippines, they had taken Malaysia, they had spread their flag across vast territories in the Dutch East Indies and throughout the island chains of the Pacific. The American Navy had been nearly crippled at Pearl Harbor, and for a time, the question was not how to defeat Japan, but whether Japan could be stopped at all. But the tide had begun to shift, very slowly, beginning in early 1942. There was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, an engagement where American and Japanese ships never actually saw each other, fighting instead through carrier-based aircraft, a harbinger of a new kind of naval warfare. Then came Midway in June, a battle that cost Japan 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, and marked the moment when, in retrospect, we can see that Japan had lost the ability to expand. They could still fight ferociously, still inflict terrible losses, but they could no longer achieve strategic victory. The question now became, how does America push back? By the middle of 1942, 2 competing visions for the Pacific War had crystallized. There was the Navy's plan, or at least the plan that would become associated with Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz and his planners envisioned a drive straight across the Central Pacific, capturing the major island chains, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and finally approaching the Philippines and Japan itself from the east. It would be a direct line, almost geometric in its precision. The advantage was clear. It was the shortest route, it would bring you closest to Japan as quickly as possible, and it put the Navy and its carrier forces at the center of the strategy. But there was another voice, and it belonged to MacArthur, who commanded the Southwest Pacific area, a vaguely defined theater that included Australia and the territories to its north. MacArthur had been forced to evacuate from the Philippines in 1942, leaving behind tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops. He had promised he would return, And that promise was not merely strategic, it was personal. It was a matter of honor and redemption in the mind of a man who had escaped capture only by fleeing. MacArthur looked at the problem differently. Instead of driving straight across the Pacific, he saw the possibility of moving up through the southwest Pacific, taking the Solomon Islands, moving into the Bismarck Archipelago, positioning himself to retake the Philippines from the south and west, all while advancing toward Japan in a kind of long, sweeping arc. The brilliance of what would become Operation Cartwheel was not that it was faster, it wasn't, but that it might be smarter. It was based on a principle that seems almost counterintuitive in warfare. You don't have to capture every enemy position. You can bypass strongholds, cut off their supplies, render them impotent, and move on. The Japanese, who had built massive fortifications on islands like Rabaul, a natural harbor and airbase complex that represented one of the most important military installations in the South Pacific, would find themselves increasingly isolated. You wouldn't have to take Rabaul itself necessarily. You could take the islands around it, you could starve it of reinforcements, and eventually it would cease to be a threat. This was a fundamentally different way of thinking about military geography. For most of human history, wars had been fought along lines, and to advance you had to clear those lines, had to fight your way through every defensive position. But the Pacific Ocean was not a line, it was a space, an enormous expanse where there were gaps and options, and places where you could maneuver around your enemy rather than through him. The challenge, of course, was that this required Navy support, transport ships, landing craft, supplies brought in by sea. It required believing that you could leave enemy positions behind you and trust that they wouldn't become a problem. It required a level of logistical coordination that had rarely been attempted in warfare before. In the months after Midway, MacArthur and his planners began to develop this idea more concretely. There were studies done, memoranda written, meetings held with far more disagreement than history often captures. The Navy was skeptical of anything that didn't center the Navy and its carriers. The Army was cautious about committing resources to a campaign that didn't have a clear endpoint. There were genuine questions about whether the approach would work, whether you could really leave fortified positions behind and trust them to remain neutralized. But there was also, it seems, a growing recognition that something had to change, that the traditional methods of island assault would result in horrendous casualties. What began to crystallize as 1942 gave way to 1943 was not a perfect plan. It was a strategy born of compromise, of different branches of the military coming together out of necessity rather than agreement, each hoping to advance their own conception of how the war should be prosecuted. MacArthur wanted his path to the Philippines. The Navy wanted to maintain its prerogatives and its own island-hopping campaign in the Central Pacific. And gradually, what emerged was something almost accidental, a two-pronged approach, with both campaigns advancing simultaneously, both feeding into a larger strategy that would eventually converge. Neither got exactly what they wanted, but together, they created something that worked. When Douglas MacArthur first arrived in Australia in March of 1942, the Pacific Theatre lay in a state that could only be described as one of profound strategic paralysis. Japan had swept through the region with a velocity that had caught the Allied command almost entirely unprepared. The Philippines had fallen, Malaya had been conquered, the Dutch East Indies, those sprawling archipelagos of immense natural wealth, now flew the rising sun, and somewhere in the vast expanse of blue water between Hawaii and Australia, American naval power had been dealt a wound at Pearl Harbor that would take years to fully heal. MacArthur himself had escaped from the Philippines under cover of darkness, arriving in Melbourne as a commander without a theatre, a general without an army, tasked with an almost impossible mandate: reverse the momentum of Japanese expansion across an ocean as wide as human ambition could stretch. The very geography of the Pacific, you might think, would have suggested an obvious strategy. Why not simply mass enough force to overwhelm the Japanese in a frontal assault? Why not gather the ships and men and supplies and meet them head-on across the widest stretches of ocean? It was a question that haunted strategic planners in Washington and military theorists in the war colleges of the East Coast. Yet MacArthur, standing in his Spartan Australian headquarters and studying maps that seemed to mock him with their vastness, began to formulate something entirely different. He began to conceive of what would eventually be called island hopping, though the term itself would not appear in official documents for some time. The concept was deceptively elegant, and it would reshape not just the conduct of the war, but the very way modern militaries would think about logistics, supply, and the conquest of territory across hostile terrain. The fundamental insight at the heart of this strategy was almost ruthlessly economical. Rather than attempting to retake every Japanese-held position across the Pacific, rather than fighting for every volcanic spit and every coral atoll, MacArthur proposed something that seemed almost counterintuitive to the conventional thinking of the day. He would strike not at the strongest points in the Japanese defensive line, but at the weakest. He would assault the lightly held islands, the ones that could be taken with the forces available. He would then use those newly captured territories as stepping stones, as launching points for the next advance, gradually squeezing the Japanese forces into an ever-tightening noose, while simultaneously moving closer to the home islands and their vast network of natural resources. The undefended island would become a base of operations. The captured base would become a platform for the next leap forward, and all the while, heavily fortified enemy positions would be left to wither on the vine, their supply lines cut, their garrisons slowly starving and growing weaker. This approach required something that most military commanders of the era found deeply uncomfortable. It required leaving enemy troops behind you, in territory that was technically still enemy-held. It required accepting that you would not achieve total territorial control. It required trusting that by making the overall strategic advancement faster and more economical, by moving forward with greater speed than your enemy could reinforce or reposition, you would ultimately render those isolated and bypassed garrisons irrelevant. And it required an enormous amount of faith in logistics, in the ability of supply ships and supply lines and supply officers working in the sweltering heat of the equatorial Pacific to keep your advancing armies fed, armed, and equipped, even as you moved farther and farther from your bases of supply. There is something almost dreamlike about the way the strategy began to take shape in those early months of 1942. MacArthur did not have the resources to launch it immediately. The United States Navy had suffered grievously at Pearl Harbor. The Army was still mobilizing, still converting factories and farms into military production, but he could see the shape of it, the elegant geometry of it, spreading across his maps like a pattern slowly coming into focus. The Japanese, for their part, were so confident in their near-term military superiority that they had spread their forces thinly across the vast territories they had conquered. They had expected either that America would sue for peace, or that the vast distances of the Pacific would prevent any serious American counteroffensive for years. They had not anticipated that an old general in Australia would look at a map and see not an impossible challenge, but a pathway forward. They had not imagined that the very distances they believed would protect them might become the means of their eventual undoing. The fundamental mathematics of the situation, when you examine them with the clarity that history provides, reveal just how constrained both sides actually were. Japan, despite its stunning initial victories, had conquered so much territory that it now faced an impossible garrison requirement. To properly defend all the islands it had taken, all the coastlines it now controlled, it would have needed millions of troops. It had hundreds of thousands at best, and they were spread across a region that covered a distance greater than the width of the continental United States. And those troops, no matter where they were stationed, had to eat, had to be supplied with ammunition, had to be reinforced when they took casualties. That meant ships. Ships to carry supplies. Ships to carry reinforcements. Ships to carry ammunition and food and medical supplies through waters that were increasingly becoming contested territory. And ships, in that phase of the war, were a resource that Japan could not easily replace. America, on the other hand, faced a different kind of constraint, one that was almost equally binding in its own way. The United States could produce ships. It could produce them in abundance. It had factories in shipyards from Maine to California that were being converted to wartime production, and within a few years would be turning out vessels at a rate that would have seemed like fantasy before the war began. But it did not yet have enough. In 1942, every ship was precious. Every landing craft was worth its weight in gold, or perhaps more accurately, its weight in strategic flexibility. Every soldier was needed in multiple places at once. Every piece of heavy equipment, every artillery gun, every tank, every aircraft represented a choice, and those choices had to be made very carefully indeed. This was the strategic reality that would shape every aspect of Operation Cartwheel. It was not a strategy born from abundance, but from scarcity. It was a strategy that emerged from the recognition that in this vast and terrible war, neither side would ever have quite enough, and so both would have to be infinitely clever in how they used what they possessed. The first landings in Operation Cartwheel would unfold across the islands of the Southwest Pacific in a pattern that MacArthur had begun to envision even before the strategy received its formal blessing from Washington. And what made this campaign so different from the grinding, attrition-heavy approach the Navy favored in the Central Pacific was something almost counterintuitive: the deliberate choice to leave enemy garrisons behind, bypassing them entirely, allowing thousands of Japanese soldiers to remain stranded on islands that would no longer matter to the advance. It required a kind of strategic confidence that not every commander possessed. The vulnerability, the exposed supply lines, the risk of being cut off, these were real concerns that kept Pentagon planners awake. Yet MacArthur believed, with a conviction that bordered on prophetic, that once you controlled the air over a given sector, the garrisons left in your wake would wither. They would become irrelevant, isolated, unable to reinforce their forward positions, unable to resupply, and so the philosophy was born, not to conquer every inch, but to leapfrog toward the ultimate objective, moving always toward the Philippines, always toward Rabaul, the massive Japanese stronghold that sat like a dark heart at the northern end of the Solomon Islands. This required a delicate coordination that had never been attempted at quite this scale before. The Army would need to work seamlessly with the Navy, something MacArthur and his naval counterparts hadn't always managed with ease. There was a history of tension between them, between the general who commanded the Southwest Pacific Theater and the admirals who controlled the seas through which his supply ships had to pass. And yet, necessity breeds cooperation, or at least a functional understanding. The early objectives in Cartwheel were deliberately modest. The Trobriand Islands came first, a cluster of small atolls that had already been partially abandoned by the Japanese, their strategic value modest, but their position essential, a stepping stone, a waypoint on the longer march. Then came the push up the New Georgia group, then further into the Solomons themselves, where the fighting would grow fiercer, where the islands themselves would offer more natural defenses for desperate Japanese commanders who had no orders to retreat. What's fascinating about this campaign, in a way that perhaps speaks to something deeper about how wars are actually won, is how much depended on mathematics rather than mere courage. The logistics equations were extraordinary. You needed to calculate not just how many men and how much ammunition, but how many ships could land in a given cove, how long supply convoys took to cycle through, whether airfields under construction could be ready in time to provide cover for the next landing. A few days' delay in bulldozing an airstrip could cascade into delays in the entire schedule. A single damaged transport ship might mean 1,000 fewer tons of food, water, and ammunition reaching the front. MacArthur's Chief of Staff, General Richard Sutherland, was meticulous about these calculations, and it was this attention to the unglamorous detail of supply, of movement, of sequencing, that often mattered more than brilliant tactical maneuvers in a given battle. The operations ran on a calendar. They had to. Rabaul wouldn't wait, and neither would the Japanese High Command's ability to reinforce their positions if the Americans allowed them time. The human cost at each stage, though, was something no amount of careful planning could eliminate. When the landings came, when the assault boats ground up onto volcanic sand, and the troops began to pour out into enemy fire, The calculus changed from pencil and paper to blood and soil. The Solomons were no tropical paradise for the invaders. They were malaria-infested, fever-ridden swamps where the enemy fought with the kind of tenacity that came from a government that viewed surrender as unthinkable, as a cultural annihilation. Japanese soldiers fought in bunkers and caves, often to the last man, choosing death over capture, a cultural imperative that the Americans were only beginning to truly comprehend. The casualty figures from even the smaller engagements were sobering. At New Georgia, a relatively minor objective, the fighting raged for several weeks, and the American casualty count climbed into the thousands. And yet there was a rhythm developing, a pattern that began to prove MacArthur's logic. Once an island was taken, once the airfield was operational, or nearly operational, the Americans could establish air superiority, and with air superiority came the capacity to protect their own supply routes, to interdict enemy reinforcements, to strangle the isolated garrisons through sheer aerial dominance. It was a virtuous cycle, once initiated. Each island captured became a platform for the next advance. Each airfield extended the radius of American fighter cover. The Japanese garrisons left behind became increasingly desperate, increasingly hollow, fighting with fewer replacements, less ammunition, less hope. The islands they'd occupied so confidently just months before became tombs, monuments to a command structure that had either underestimated American capability or simply had no good options remaining. Some of these garrisons would hold out for months, even until the end of the war, never formally surrendering, waiting for rescue that would never come. It was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the campaign, the deliberate abandonment of enemy soldiers, the acceptance that some men would die on islands no one cared about anymore, in service of a larger strategic goal that had moved far beyond their reach. The Japanese, for their part, had settled into what they believed would be an impenetrable defensive perimeter across the vast reaches of the southwestern Pacific. They had constructed airfields, fortified positions, supply depots, and interconnected garrison networks that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and scattered islands like a delicate web of stone and steel. Port Moresby sat beyond their grasp, protected now by terrain and distance, yet the Japanese commanders remained convinced that MacArthur would attempt a frontal assault, would come directly at them across open water where their naval superiority could be brought to bear in full, devastating force. This assumption, this expectation of predictable aggression, became the foundation upon which MacArthur's entire strategy would be built. The general understood something fundamental about warfare that many of his peers seemed to overlook, that the enemy's expectations, when properly misdirected, become a form of weakness. If they believed you would attack directly, then the moment you chose a different path, that belief became a burden they carried, a weight of false preparation that drained resources and divided attention. MacArthur had studied amphibious doctrine in ways that few American commanders had, and he had come to see the Philippine campaigns and various island operations not as isolated tactical problems, but as expressions of a single coherent vision. By late 1942, as he worked with his staff officers in Brisbane, men like General Richard Sutherland and others who shared his confidence in the audacious approach, MacArthur began to articulate what would become Operation Cartwheel in its most essential form. The concept hinged on a principle almost mathematical in its elegance. Rather than fighting for every island, every fortification, every stubbornly held atoll across the Japanese defensive line, MacArthur would select his points of attack with surgical precision. He would land his forces where the Japanese were weak or distracted, where natural advantage could be multiplied by speed and concentration of force. Most crucially, he would move in a great arc that curled around the Japanese strongholds rather than directly through them. This technique, which would later be called island hopping, though the term itself would not become common until historians began to describe it in retrospect, was less a new invention than a refinement of existing possibilities, a way of asking, what if we bypassed the fortress and attacked what the fortress protected? Consider the geography for a moment. The Bismarck Archipelago, New Britain, the Solomons Chain, and the other territories held by Japan formed a kind of vast necklace of islands extending northwestward from Australia. To fight through each one sequentially, to reduce each garrison, to establish airfields on each bit of captured ground, and then move to the next, this would take years. The Americans simply did not have years. They had supplies, growing supplies as American industry reached full war production, but they had limited patience from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, limited public will back home, and an uncertain timeline in Europe where Germany still represented a formidable threat. MacArthur's vision compressed this timeline. By attacking certain islands and leaving others in enemy hands but isolated and strategically neutralized, he could advance the date of any future push toward the Philippines by months, perhaps by a year or more. The first phase of Cartwheel would focus on securing the Solomon Islands, particularly Guadalcanal, which the Marines had already begun to fight for in the grueling campaign that had started in August of 1942. This island, and the chain extending northwestward from it, would provide stepping stones. But it was not enough to simply hold these islands. MacArthur envisioned them as springboards for air operations, as bases from which American aircraft could range outward and strike at Japanese positions beyond the advance. If you controlled the air above a particular region, you could project power far beyond the physical extent of your ground forces. An airfield on Guadalcanal could shelter fighter planes whose radius extended 100 miles or more, could cover supply convoys, could interdict Japanese movements, could gradually suffocate enemy garrisons on islands you had chosen not to attack directly. The broader arc of the operation would then swing upward and westward. After the Solomons came the Bismarck Archipelago, and particularly the island of New Britain. Here too, rather than attempting a complete conquest, American forces would land at Cape Gloucester on the western end of the island, bypassing the major Japanese concentration at Rabaul on the eastern end. Rabaul was the jewel of Japanese defense in the Southwest Pacific, a major naval base with extensive airfields and garrison facilities. But if MacArthur could isolate it, if he could land forces on New Britain beyond it, if he could eventually advance to the Admiralty Islands further north, then Rabaul would become what military strategists call a cork in a bottle, isolated, cut off from supply and reinforcement, gradually weakened by air attack and the simple inability to conduct normal operations. It could be bypassed entirely. The resources normally required to assault such a fortress could be used instead for continued advance. This was the conceptual heart of Cartwheel, though it would evolve and develop as circumstances changed and as each operation succeeded or ran into unexpected resistance. The fundamental question at its core remained constant. Why should we accept the enemy's choice of battleground? Why should we fight where they are strongest, when we could choose instead to fight where we are strongest and leave them with nothing but the hollow fortress they occupy? There is something deeply economic about this logic, something that reflects MacArthur's own strategic philosophy, the idea that war is not merely an exercise in courage or firepower, but in positioning, in the proper application of leverage and timing. One might wonder whether other commanders, perhaps more cautious by nature or more bound by conventional doctrine, would have attempted such an approach. Would they have trusted their ability to isolate Japanese strongholds and rely on air power and supply to do what direct assault would have done more immediately? The risks were real enough. If Japanese forces managed to organize a counterattack from one of the bypassed islands, if they could reinforce their positions or launch a major naval operation, the entire strategy could come undone. An American force that had advanced northward might find itself exposed to attack from behind. Supply lines could be cut. There was a certain ruthlessness required in this approach, a willingness to accept the possibility of losing units or ships if that loss could be offset by the larger strategic gain. Yet as MacArthur and his staff refined the operation through the autumn and early winter of 1942, moving into 1943, there grew a kind of confidence that this approach would work, not because it was absolutely certain, but because it seemed to offer the best available balance between acceptable losses and forward progress. The first weeks of Operation Cartwheel unfolded not as a grand sweeping advance, but as a careful, methodical accumulation of small victories, each one purchased with blood and calculation in equal measure. MacArthur's amphibious movements began in earnest in late June of 1943, when American forces landed on the islands of New Georgia in the Solomon Islands chain, a place that would test every assumption about island warfare that had been forged in the earlier campaigns. The Japanese, by this point, had learned to adapt their defenses with a kind of grim sophistication. They no longer simply waited on the beaches for an invasion that would announce itself with the thunder of naval guns. Instead, they retreated inland, digging systems of underground fortifications and connecting bunkers that turned each island into a three-dimensional maze of resistance. These weren't hastily constructed positions either. Japanese engineers had studied the lessons of Guadalcanal and Tarawa with meticulous attention, and they applied those lessons with the kind of determination that comes from knowing you are fighting on ground that you believe is yours by right of conquest. The battle for New Georgia became a lesson in the sheer cost of island hopping when the enemy fought with discipline and preparation. American forces landed against relatively light initial resistance, which itself became a kind of danger because it created a false impression of ease, of quick victory just beyond the next ridge. But as the Americans pushed inland, the character of the fighting changed. Machine gun nests emerged from seemingly solid earth. Caves that had been sealed with cunningly camouflaged entrances opened up with devastating fire. A single Japanese soldier, entrenched in a bunker and armed with little more than rifle and determination, could hold up an entire company for hours or even days. This was the brutal arithmetic of island warfare, and it meant that Operation Cartwheel, for all its elegance as a strategic conception, would be measured in weeks and months of grinding, attritional combat, rather than in quick, clean movements across a map. What made New Georgia particularly significant in the broader context of Cartwheel wasn't merely the fighting itself, but what it revealed about the nature of MacArthur's campaign philosophy. MacArthur had always believed in the power of maneuver, of using speed and surprise to create advantage, but New Georgia demonstrated that maneuver alone could not replace the hard work of defeating entrenched defenders. The campaign there lasted nearly 2 months, far longer than the optimists in MacArthur's headquarters had anticipated. Yet the Japanese garrison, numbering perhaps 10,000 soldiers, could not be easily dislodged. They fought with a kind of purposeful stubbornness, withdrawing slowly from position to position, inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers, and only evacuating when they absolutely had to, carrying away what supplies and personnel they could salvage. This grinding quality began to establish a rhythm for Operation Cartwheel that would persist throughout its execution. The American forces would identify a target island, usually one that held strategic value because of its airstrip or its position on the line of advance toward Rabaul. Intelligence would be gathered, plans would be drawn up, and the amphibious forces would assemble their ships and landing craft. Then would come the landing itself, which, in the months after the invasion doctrine had been refined, usually came off with reasonable smoothness. But then the grinding would begin. The Japanese would conduct what they called delaying actions, which is to say they would fight a series of rearguard battles designed not to win, but to extract as high a price as possible before withdrawing or being annihilated. Each island fought this way, and each island contributed its small portion of lessons to the growing body of American tactical knowledge about how to conduct amphibious warfare against a determined and well-prepared enemy. The supply and logistical dimensions of Cartwheel also began to reveal themselves more fully during this phase of the campaign. An amphibious operation of this scale, repeated again and again across weeks and months, required not just fighting men, but an enormous apparatus of support. Ships had to be moved into position. Food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies had to be transported. Repairs had to be made to damaged vessels. Wounded men had to be evacuated, sometimes over considerable distances, to hospital ships and field hospitals. All of this had to happen while the campaign was still actively unfolding, while new objectives were being identified, and while the Japanese were still capable of conducting air attacks against the American fleet. The logistical tale of Operation Cartwheel grew longer and more complex with each passing week, and the management of that tale became almost as important to MacArthur's staff as the tactical planning of the actual landings. One aspect of this logistical reality that often escapes notice in the broader historical accounts is the role played by the Australian forces, who were increasingly integrated into Cartwheel as the campaign moved northward. MacArthur had always worked closely with Australian commanders, and the Australian 6th and 7th Armies became crucial components of his advancing forces. The Australians brought with them not only fresh combat troops but also local knowledge, gained through their operations in New Guinea and the surrounding islands in earlier phases of the war. They understood the terrain, the climate, the diseases that plagued the region. They knew what it meant to fight in the tropical wilderness, and they could teach these hard-won lessons to American soldiers who were seeing this type of warfare for the first time. It's worth pausing to reflect on how often the history of the Pacific War becomes, in popular memory, an exclusively American story, when in fact, the regional dynamics were far more complex. Australia's role in Cartwheel was substantial and often crucial, yet it remains less prominent in the historical consciousness than it perhaps deserves to be. The Japanese command structure in the South Pacific was meanwhile undergoing its own recalibrations. General Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the principal commander of Japanese naval forces, had been killed earlier in the year when his aircraft was shot down during an inspection tour of forward positions. This was a catastrophic loss for the Japanese war effort, and it created a leadership vacuum that was never fully filled. The Japanese Navy struggled to coordinate with the Army. The various island garrisons, some of them under Army command and others under Navy command, operated with less coherence and unified purpose than they might have. Meanwhile, the Japanese home islands were beginning to feel the effects of American industrial might in ways they could not yet fully comprehend. The flow of replacement ships, replacement aircraft, and replacement soldiers to the Pacific was becoming an increasingly one-sided affair. For every Japanese warship lost, American shipyards were producing multiple replacements. For every Japanese trained pilot killed, the Japanese pilot training pipeline could only barely produce one replacement, while American pilot training programs were turning out dozens. The period of late summer and early autumn of 1943 thus became a kind of critical transition point in Operation Cartwheel. The campaign was working. Each island, painstakingly taken, represented a mile marker on the road toward Rabaul. The Japanese were being pushed back, forced to abandon positions they had held for months or even years, yet the cost was beginning to accumulate, and there was no indication that the Japanese intended to simply surrender or flee. This was a campaign, in other words, that would have to be fought to its conclusion, not merely commenced and allowed to run its course through the mere momentum of American industrial advantage. That realization, settling over the headquarters of Cartwheel as the autumn rains began to fall on the tropical islands of the Solomon Chain, would shape everything that followed. The forces under MacArthur's command began their movements toward the Solomon Islands in the early months of 1943, and with each ship that departed, each transport laden with supplies and equipment, the machinery of Cartwheel was becoming something real and tangible, rather than merely lines on a strategic map. The Japanese held formidable positions throughout the archipelago, garrisons on islands that had become, in their understanding, fortresses of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, bastions that were thought to be nearly impregnable. Yet MacArthur and his planners had identified something that others had perhaps underestimated: the power of careful selection, of knowing which points to strike and which to leave, for the moment, untouched. By June of that year, the campaign's first major offensive began with the assault on New Georgia, an island whose terrain was dense with jungle, and whose defenders were preparing, with characteristic determination, to make the battle costly. The Americans would land not with the entire force at once, but with calculated landings that aimed to establish footholds, to build airfields from which they could dominate the skies above neighboring positions. There was something almost architectural in the way MacArthur conceptualized these movements. Each island a foundation stone, each airfield a buttress supporting the next phase of advance. The jungle itself became an adversary as formidable as the Japanese soldiers who moved through it. Swamps that seemed endless, vegetation so thick that visibility shrank to mere yards, insects that carried disease, and a humidity that turned every breath into labor. The men who waded through this landscape often moved in a kind of delirium, their uniforms heavy with sweat and moisture, their minds beginning to drift in ways that combat demanded they not allow. Supply lines stretched thin across the ocean, and yet somehow, through what many observers later called a miracle of logistical coordination, they held. Ammunition arrived. Food, though never abundant, was sufficient. Medical personnel worked in makeshift stations, treating not only wounds, but the ravages of malaria, dengue fever, and the thousand small infections that jungle warfare inevitably brought. What was perhaps most significant about New Georgia was not the tactical brilliance it required, though that was substantial, but rather what it demonstrated about the feasibility of the entire strategy. The island fell after weeks of bitter combat, but it did fall, and with it came the capture of airfields that MacArthur's planners had targeted. From these fields, fighters and bombers could now range across the waters toward the next objectives. The pattern was beginning to establish itself with sufficient clarity that planners elsewhere, in Washington, in London, in other theaters of operation, began to recognize that something new was being tested here, in the waters around the Solomon Islands. The cost, however, was never insignificant. Thousands of young men, many of them volunteers from towns and cities across America, found themselves walking into an environment entirely foreign to their experience. A farm boy from Nebraska, a shopkeeper's son from Philadelphia, a fisherman from Maine, they arrived in landing craft, stepped into water that came to their chest, and suddenly found themselves in the midst of something that their training, though rigorous, could never have fully prepared them for. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, fought with a discipline and a fatalism that came from their own training and their own cultural values. Death in battle was, to many Japanese soldiers, preferable to surrender, and this conviction made them extraordinarily difficult opponents. Yet there was, even in the midst of this costly fighting, an undeniable sense that momentum was shifting. The Americans were learning as they went. Commanders adapted tactics based on what worked and what did not. Naval forces, which had suffered terribly in earlier engagements with the Japanese, were growing more skilled and more confident in their operations at night, when the superior American radar equipment gave them advantages that darkness could not conceal from electronic detection. The pilots flying from the newly captured airfields found themselves increasingly dominant in daylight hours, when American fighter planes, particularly as newer models became available, began to demonstrate superiority over Japanese aircraft that, while maneuverable and deadly, were becoming less numerous with each passing week. The human element of this advance was rarely simple or clean. There were moments of extraordinary courage, certainly. Men who charged pillboxes knowing the odds were poor, medics who crawled toward wounded soldiers through fire, officers who made decisions that sacrificed the few to save the many. But there were also moments of confusion, of fear, of soldiers who simply wanted to survive and return home. Some found escape in the numbness that combat could produce. Others were undone by it, their minds fractured by experiences that language struggled to encompass. Between engagements, in the lulls that occasionally emerged, the men of Cartwheel existed in a strange liminal space. Letters were written home, letters that often said very little of what had actually occurred, for how does one describe a firefight to someone sitting safely thousands of miles away? Games of cards were played by lamplight, cigarettes were shared, conversations drifted to home, to families, to peacetime occupations that seemed almost fantastical in their ordinariness. These quiet moments, fleeting though they were perhaps the moments in which the true weight of what was happening the vast machinery of death and displacement, was most keenly felt. And yet the operation continued. Plans were already being drawn up for the next phase, the next island, the next airfield to be captured and developed. The tempo of Cartwheel was a carefully calibrated rhythm, neither so fast that supply lines shattered under the strain, nor so slow that the enemy retained opportunity to reinforce and consolidate. It was a rhythm that demanded constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance about the state of men and machines, and the vast material resources required to sustain such an operation across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. The broader strategic picture, though it may have seemed distant to the men actually engaged in the fighting, was becoming increasingly clear to those at higher echelons of command. The island-hopping strategy was proving viable. Casualties, while significant, were sustainable. The enemy, though formidable, could be pushed back step by step. And perhaps most importantly, the strategy was demonstrating that the Pacific War, for all its apparent vastness and complexity, might eventually be won not through some apocalyptic final battle, but through a succession of smaller victories, each one bringing Allied forces inexorably closer to the home islands of Japan itself. Machinery was working, even if the grinding of its gears came at a human cost that would never be fully accounted for in the history books that would later be written. The twin prongs of MacArthur's strategy were now in motion, and the Admiral began to understand what his younger rival in the Navy was truly attempting. While Nimitz pushed westward across the central Pacific through the coral atolls, MacArthur's forces were preparing something altogether different, a campaign of encirclement and suffocation, where entire Japanese garrisons would find themselves bypassed, cut off from supply, and left to wither on forgotten islands. This was not the head-on collision that military tradition had always demanded. This was something more elegant, more economical in blood, if one could accept such a thing in wartime. The concept itself had emerged from a peculiar confluence of necessity and innovation. MacArthur possessed fewer ships, fewer landing craft, and fewer of the great capital vessels that dominated naval warfare. He could not afford the kind of frontal assault that Nimitz could potentially wage. But he had something else. He had geography, he had surprise, and he had what we might call strategic patience. The islands themselves became his instrument. Between Guadalcanal and the Philippines stretched a vast archipelago, a constellation of Japanese-held territories that formed a loose defensive perimeter. What if, MacArthur reasoned to those around him, in those planning sessions in Brisbane and later Melbourne, what if we did not attack every island? What if we selected only those positions necessary to establish airfields, to secure our flanks, and to gradually strangle the enemy supply lines? The logic was sound, even if it violated certain deeply held military instincts. To leave Japanese soldiers alive behind your advancing lines, to knowingly pass over fortified positions without engaging them, this ran counter to everything that military academies taught about maintaining a cohesive front. Yet MacArthur understood something profound about the nature of modern warfare in the Pacific. Japanese reinforcements had to arrive by ship. Japanese soldiers had to eat, had to receive ammunition, had to receive orders from their command structure. If you could sever those connections, the garrison became less an army and more a collection of increasingly isolated men. Consider the practical reality of the situation as it stood in the middle months of 1943. Japanese forces held a string of fortified positions stretching from the Solomons through New Guinea and into the Bismarck archipelago. Each represented a significant investment of resources, personnel, and supplies. The Japanese Navy had committed extensively to defending these positions, but every ship dedicated to supply runs was a ship unavailable for combat operations elsewhere. Every pilot assigned to defend a particular airfield was a pilot not available for another theatre. The Japanese were stretched across too vast a territory with insufficient resources to reinforce every point simultaneously. MacArthur's plan exploited this thinness methodically. Instead of attacking Rabaul directly, a fortress so heavily fortified and so extensively garrisoned that it might consume months of fighting and countless casualties, he would advance along a path that bypassed it entirely. He would establish positions close enough to neutralize Rabaul's capacity to project power, but not so close as to require direct assault. American airfields advancing up the New Guinea coast and through the Solomon Islands would place Japanese bases within range of constant air interdiction. Supply convoys heading to isolated garrisons would become targets for bombing raids. The noose would tighten gradually, almost imperceptibly, until Japanese commanders found themselves commanding isolated islands where reinforcement had become impossible and resupply increasingly sporadic. The implications of this approach extended beyond mere military efficiency. There was something almost melancholic about it, when one considers the human cost embedded within these calculations. Thousands of Japanese soldiers would find themselves abandoned on islands that became ghost posts, their situation growing progressively more desperate as supply ships failed to arrive, as air support became unavailable, as the radius of Japanese control contracted month by month. Some would eventually be captured. Many would perish not in combat but from disease, malnutrition, and the slow attrition of isolation. Others would remain on these islands long after Japan's surrender, not yet aware that the war had ended, still waiting for relief that would never come. Yet for the moment, in the planning stages of 1943, the strategy represented a kind of pragmatic brilliance. MacArthur had calculated roughly how many troops would be necessary to secure each position. He had calculated which islands were truly essential and which could be bypassed. He had begun to accumulate the landing craft and support vessels necessary for the campaign, and he had done something else that proved remarkably prescient. He had begun to cultivate a relationship with the Australian forces and the supplies available in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. This was not going to be a purely American operation. It could not be. The resources simply were not available for such an undertaking, and the cooperation of Australian military leaders had become essential to the entire enterprise. The Australian role in Operation Cartwheel deserves a kind of gentle emphasis here, for it is sometimes overlooked in narratives that centre exclusively on American participation. Australia had already been fighting in the Pacific for nearly 2 years by the time MacArthur's campaign took shape. The Australian Army had fought in North Africa before being redeployed to defend their homeland. They knew the terrain of the Southwest Pacific intimately. They had suffered losses in the early months of the war that had shocked their national consciousness, and they were, by 1943, far from reluctant to engage the Japanese on every opportunity. MacArthur recognized this both as a resource and as a necessity. The campaign ahead would require infantry, would require soldiers willing to move through jungle terrain, would require men who could operate in the difficult conditions of New Guinea and the surrounding islands. The Australians provided exactly this capacity, and their participation meant that the operation would have the logistical and numerical strength necessary to succeed. As the spring and summer of 1943 progressed, the various components of Operation Cartwheel began to take shape in earnest. Airfields were constructed and expanded, supply depots were established, transport ships were allocated and their routes planned. Intelligence officers worked to understand Japanese dispositions, to identify the most lightly held positions, to locate the most strategic islands for airfield construction. The Navy trained extensively in amphibious operations, a skill that had to be relearned after decades of relative neglect. Marines and Army troops rehearsed their assault techniques, practiced rapid offloading, familiarized themselves with the equipment that would carry them ashore. There was an almost mechanical quality to these preparations, yet they represented the transformation of a concept into concrete military capability. I acknowledge all requirements and constraints. I am writing only the pure spoken narration for Stretch 8, Deepening the Story, Part 7, of a sleep documentary on Operation Cartwheel. This is a middle section. I will begin mid-flow, without hooks, subscribe lines, or section labels. Target: Dupshu 75143 characters. Sleep cadence: 75-100. Pacing: 35-100. Calm warm tone. No headings or brackets. Pure continuous voiceover. As the spring of 1943 turned toward summer, the rhythm of Cartwheel's operations began to settle into something that resembled, in the peculiar mathematics of war, a kind of grim routine. What had started as audacious improvisations, small landings, quick strikes, retreats into the humid jungle, was evolving into something more systematic, more deliberate, more inexorable. The momentum, though it would have seemed impossible just months earlier, was beginning to shift. And at the heart of this shift was a principle that MacArthur had come to embrace with an almost philosophical conviction: the idea that not every stronghold needed to be taken, and not every enemy had to be defeated in direct combat. This concept, which historians would later study with the kind of reverence usually reserved for military doctrine, grew from a simple but revolutionary observation. The Japanese had sprawled across the Southwest Pacific in a vast, interconnected web of garrisons, airfields, and supply lines. Each stronghold was theoretically connected to the others. Each fortress was meant to reinforce its neighbors. But what if, MacArthur reasoned, those connections could be severed? What if, instead of battering down every door, one could simply walk around the locked ones? What if isolation itself could become a weapon? The practical application of this thinking took on a name that would echo through military academies for decades to come: the strategy of bypassing. It was neither retreat nor full assault. It was something in between, something that required both courage and a willingness to leave chaos in one's wake. Troops would be landed, not where the enemy was strongest, but where the terrain offered advantage and the enemy was thinnest. The surrounding garrisons, cut off from resupply, abandoned by the main advance, would gradually suffocate. Their soldiers would watch helplessly as the war moved on around them, leaving them behind like castaways on islands that had suddenly ceased to matter. Consider the practical implications, if you will, of such a strategy. It meant that young American soldiers, landing on a beach at dawn, would not necessarily expect what they had been trained to expect. There would be no massive enemy force waiting at the shoreline. The beach might be quiet, almost eerily so. The resistance, when it came, would be different than the frontal assaults that had characterized so much of the fighting in other theaters. It was a disorienting reversal, and yet, and here lies one of the deeper paradoxes of the war in the Pacific, it was also deeply humane in its own way. Fewer men would die in direct combat if fewer men were forced to meet face to face. The mathematics were brutal, certainly, but they were less brutal than the alternative. The implementation of this strategy revealed something important about MacArthur himself, something that those who knew him well might have recognized but that his critics often overlooked. He was not, despite his reputation, purely a believer in the grand gesture or the overwhelming offensive. He could be, when circumstances demanded it, a strategist of remarkable flexibility. He understood that the archipelago stretched before him was not a single battlefield, but hundreds of them, and that victory did not require the conquest of each one. It required, instead, the control of those that mattered: the airfields, the bases, the points of leverage. The rest could be left to languish. But implementing this vision across the vast distances and chaotic realities of the Southwest Pacific was another matter entirely. Supply lines had to be established, maintained, protected. Amphibious landings, those delicate, dangerous operations where men and machines were transferred from ship to shore in the face of potential enemy fire, had to be coordinated with precision. The Navy, which controlled the waters between the islands, had to be convinced that MacArthur's army operations were worth protecting, worth supporting, worth the precious resources that were themselves always in short supply. And the Japanese, naturally, were not cooperating. They were adapting too, developing their own countermeasures, their own understanding of what the Americans were attempting to do. By the middle months of 1943, the campaign had begun to take on the shape that MacArthur had envisioned, though not without friction and setbacks along the way. Some operations had gone more smoothly than others. Some had cost more lives than anticipated. But the direction was becoming clear. The line of American advance was pushing northwestward, up the coast of New Guinea and through the Solomon Islands, gathering momentum like a wave that, once set in motion, becomes difficult to stop. The bypassed garrisons, places with names that most Americans would never learn to pronounce correctly, were being left behind, their radios still crackling with orders from Tokyo that could no longer be fulfilled, their supply ships sunk, their sense of purpose gradually eroding like sand beneath the tropical rains. There is something haunting, when one pauses to consider it, about an army that simply ceases to be relevant to the war's outcome. The soldiers stationed at these isolated garrisons had not been defeated in battle. They had simply been left behind by the tide of war. They would continue to exist on their islands, performing their duties with diminishing supplies, for months and in some cases for years. Some would survive the war itself, others would not. But their role in determining the outcome of the Pacific War had essentially ended before they fully comprehended what had happened. By the autumn of 1943, the rhythm of Cartwheel had begun to settle into something almost mechanical, though no less brutal for its predictability. The Americans and Australians had learned, through hard-won lessons and considerable cost, how to compress the ancient art of amphibious warfare into a repeating cycle. Land here, secure the airfield, build the infrastructure, move forward. Each operation was a refinement of the one before, each island a classroom where the next assault was studied in advance, its lessons already waiting in the minds of those who would execute it. The Admiralty Islands lay ahead now, a stepping stone that seemed almost to offer itself to the advancing alliance. They rose from the Bismarck Sea like a promise, and MacArthur's planners examined them with the meticulous care that had become their hallmark by now. What had begun as audacious gamble was becoming systematic mastery, though the losses that came with each forward leap never diminished in their weight. Men still died on these islands, sometimes by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds, and each body counted as the price of momentum. One of the remarkable aspects of Operation Cartwheel, something that historians sometimes overlook in their focus on the grand strategy, was the way it functioned as a proving ground for tactical innovation. Amphibious assault is not merely a matter of will or courage, though both matter enormously. It is a problem of logistics so complex that the mind sometimes struggles to encompass it. How do you land supplies on a beach where Japanese artillery might at any moment find their range? How do you move ammunition inland faster than your enemy can move reinforcements to counter you? How do you maintain the morale of men who know they will face entrenched defenders with machine guns and fortified positions? These were not abstract questions for the planners gathered in Brisbane. They were daily riddles requiring daily solutions. The lessons that MacArthur's command had absorbed by this point were beginning to crystallize into something approaching doctrine. The preliminary bombardment needed to last long enough to suppress enemy fire, but not so long that it gave away the assault's exact timing. Air superiority needed to be established and maintained, which meant the airfields captured in previous operations had to remain secure and functional, a reminder that Cartwheel was not merely a string of separate invasions, but rather a single, continuous operation in which each piece depended upon all the others. The landing craft themselves had to be handled with care, coordinated with precision, and protected from counterattack until enough troops and firepower had been pushed ashore to establish a defensible perimeter. There was something almost somnolent about the way these operations were now unfolding, at least from the vantage point of those who planned them. The chaos and improvisation of the earlier campaigns had given way to a more measured rhythm. Yet this smoothing of the process concealed something troubling, or perhaps merely realistic. The Japanese, watching this American advance with growing despair, were adapting as well. They began to recognize the pattern. They could predict, with reasonable accuracy, where the next blow would fall. And knowing this, they began to prepare not elaborate defenses, but rather something more philosophical, an acceptance that this island, or that one, would be lost, but that perhaps the next fight, or the one after that, might be the place where the American momentum could finally be checked. The supply lines stretching back from the forward positions had become vast and complex networks of ships, trucks, warehouses, and airfields. One historian of the campaign observed that Cartwheel was not truly a military operation at all, but rather a gigantic exercise in logistics that happened to involve combat. This is perhaps too cynical an observation, yet it contains a grain of truth that repays reflection. The soldier firing a rifle at a Japanese position depended upon a chain of supply that might stretch back thousands of miles, through submarine-infested waters, across vast distances that seemed almost incomprehensible to the men actually engaged in fighting. The fact that this chain held together, that ammunition arrived when it was needed, that wounded men could be evacuated to hospitals, that reinforcements appeared when they were required, was as much a victory as any tactical success on any particular beach. MacArthur himself had begun to experience something that might be called vindication, though he was too proud a man to allow such satisfaction to show openly. The skepticism that had attended his plan, the whispered doubts from Washington about whether an island-hopping strategy was truly the way to defeat Japan, had begun to fade as the results accumulated. Operation Cartwheel was working. The Central Pacific approach under Admiral Nimitz was also working, though moving at a different pace and following a different strategic logic. Yet here in MacArthur's theatre, the formula had proven sound. Push forward, secure airfields, expand the perimeter of control, move again. By late 1943, the strategic picture in the Pacific had shifted noticeably, though perhaps not always as obviously as one might expect. The American industrial capacity continued to produce ships, planes, and soldiers in seemingly inexhaustible supply. The Japanese, by contrast, were beginning to feel the pinch, not in any catastrophic way yet, but in the accumulated weight of every ship sunk, every pilot lost, every island abandoned. The mathematics of attrition were beginning to turn decisively in the Allies' favor, and those strategists who understood statistics could perceive it, even if the outcome was still months or years away. Did the Japanese leadership fully comprehend this mathematical certainty of their eventual defeat? Some historians argue they did, or at least that certain members of the Japanese military hierarchy understood it. Others suggest that cultural factors, honor, and the Japanese martial tradition made such calculations almost irrelevant to decision-making. The truth, as so often, likely lay somewhere between. The human experience of Cartwheel, however, remained throughout all these strategic considerations, stubbornly particular and local. For the individual soldier involved in any given assault, the grand strategic picture was invisible, irrelevant, almost incomprehensible. What mattered was the man next to you, the ammunition in your belt, the way the sand felt beneath you as you crouched behind cover, the larger operation, the coordination of forces across hundreds of miles, the grand design that MacArthur and his planners studied over maps in climate-controlled headquarters. All of this was noise, a background hum beneath the immediate reality of danger and survival. And yet it was precisely because MacArthur understood both levels, because he could think simultaneously in terms of grand strategy and tactical detail, that Operation Cartwheel succeeded where other such ambitious operations might have faltered. By late 1943, as the ring of captured islands began to widen around the Japanese perimeter, MacArthur found himself presiding over something far more intricate than any single general had imagined when the war began. The map room in his headquarters had become almost like a living organism, dotted with markers that inched forward month by month, each representing thousands of men, countless ships, and decisions that would echo through families for generations to come. The island-hopping strategy was no longer merely a plan on paper. It had become a rhythm, a cadence of warfare that demanded precision in ways that conventional military doctrine had scarcely prepared anyone for. One of the most revealing aspects of Operation Cartwheel, as autumn turned to winter in 1943, was how deeply MacArthur had learned to think about logistics in relation to geography. The general had always been a student of terrain and tactics, but the scattered nature of the Pacific theater forced him to become something closer to a merchant and engineer as well. Each island secured meant not just a military foothold, but a supply depot, an airfield site, a potential hospital location, a staging ground for the next bound forward. A commander could no longer simply think about moving soldiers from point A to point B. He had to think about moving men, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, construction materials, and replacement parts across vast stretches of empty ocean, often in ships that were themselves vulnerable to attack. Consider the mathematics of it for a moment. To keep even a modest force of 10,000 men alive on a newly captured island required perhaps 200 tons of supplies per day under normal conditions, and considerably more if fighting was ongoing. These supplies could not be stockpiled carelessly. They had to be rotated carefully to prevent spoilage in the intense humidity and heat of the tropics. Fresh water became gold in value. Refrigeration was crude and precious. Disease, dengue fever, malaria, dysentery, and infections threatened to reduce combat strength almost as effectively as enemy bullets. MacArthur's medical officer, General Charles Baird, had to develop protocols for island sanitation that seemed almost quaint by modern standards, yet proved extraordinarily effective. Drainage systems, latrine placement, drinking water purification by boiling and chemical treatment, all of it had to be organized at scale, across dozens of locations simultaneously. The naval dimension of Cartwheel had similarly evolved into something increasingly sophisticated. In the early phases, the Japanese had possessed superior naval forces in the region, and every American naval movement carried significant risk. But as 1943 wore on, and new American ships, particularly destroyers and the emerging fast carriers, arrived in theater, the balance began to shift. MacArthur's relationship with the Navy remained complicated. He was not a naval officer. He did not instinctively understand the constraints and opportunities that naval operations presented. Yet he had learned, through his collaboration with Admiral Halsey and through painful experience, that land campaigns and naval campaigns had to be choreographed together like dancers who needed to move in perfect synchronization or risk collision and disaster. The Australian forces under MacArthur's command had proven themselves invaluable, and their role deepened as Cartwheel advanced. Australian regiments, accustomed to jungle warfare from their own defensive struggles against Japanese invasion threats, brought an accumulated wisdom about movement through dense vegetation, about reading signs in the forest, about improvisation and adaptation. They understood tropical disease. They had developed their own methods for dealing with the challenges of heat and insects, and the profound disorientation that could come from moving through terrain where visibility often extended no more than a few yards. In some ways, the Australian experience offered MacArthur access to knowledge that American troops, drawn largely from temperate climates, had yet to fully absorb. By this point in the operation, the human cost had become increasingly apparent in ways that charts and casualty statistics only partially captured. Each island secured meant soldiers left behind in graves, in hospital ships, in letters home that had to be written and rewritten because the words never quite seemed adequate. The Marine replacements arriving in theatre had begun to change in character. The first wave of eager volunteers was being supplemented by draftees, younger men whose commitment was real, but whose introduction to combat was often shockingly abrupt. MacArthur was acutely aware that morale, that almost intangible element of military readiness, depended on his men believing that each sacrifice moved them closer to victory, not simply closer to the next island that would require the same sacrifice repeated. The intelligence picture during this middle phase of Cartwheel had become increasingly complex. MacArthur relied heavily on his intelligence chief, General Charles Willoughby, a man of remarkable capability and, some would suggest, remarkable prejudices. Willoughby had developed an almost uncanny ability to read Japanese intentions, to anticipate where enemy forces would consolidate and defend. Yet the flow of intelligence itself had become more voluminous and sometimes more contradictory. Ultra-intelligence, the decrypted Japanese radio communications, provided windows into enemy thinking, but decryption took time, and by the time a message was decoded and analyzed and transmitted to the field commander, the situation it described might have already shifted. How could a general operate on intelligence that was simultaneously profound and potentially obsolete? The rhythm of the campaign had begun to establish a pattern that was becoming almost predictable in its broad outlines, even if the specific details of each operation remained shrouded in the uncertainty that always accompanies warfare. Reconnaissance would identify a target island or group of islands. Intelligence would assess enemy strength and disposition. Logistics would plan the supply run required to support the operation. Naval forces would be positioned to provide gunfire support and to protect against Japanese naval interference. Engineers would prepare landing craft and plan the assault sequence. And then, at dawn or in the darkness before dawn, men would wade ashore into an unknown that no amount of planning could fully illuminate. Some would return, some would not. And those who returned would carry forward toward the next island, the next dawn, the next assault. What made MacArthur's approach distinctive, even amid all these standard military processes, was his willingness to think about the Pacific War as something fundamentally different from the European War. He seemed to sense, in ways that not all his peers did, that the vast distances, the dispersed enemy positions, and the dependence on sea power and air power meant that traditional army doctrine, the emphasis on concentrated force, on holding ground, on positional warfare, might be less applicable here. Instead, he was developing what might be called a strategy of continuous movement, of never allowing the Japanese time to consolidate their defenses, of maintaining momentum even when resources were stretched thin and logistics groaned under the strain. By the middle months of 1944, the momentum MacArthur had built had begun to reshape the entire geography of the war in the Pacific. The island-hopping strategy was no longer an experiment or a desperate improvisation, but a tried and tested instrument that had proven itself across the Coral Sea, along the coasts of New Guinea, and throughout the Solomon Islands. What had once been questioned in the halls of Washington and debated among military planners had become almost automatic, a rhythm that both the Navy and the Army had learned to move to with increasing precision and confidence. Yet even as the campaigns progressed with growing success, the true test of the strategy was only beginning to reveal itself. For you see, the islands that MacArthur's forces had taken so far, Guadalcanal, Ley, Salamaua, and all the countless atolls and coral outposts in between, these had been, in a sense, the opening moves. They had served as stepping stones, certainly, but the campaign was now preparing to leap toward objectives of far greater consequence. The Central Pacific Islands lay ahead, and beyond them, the Philippines themselves, where millions of Filipino civilians remained under Japanese occupation, and where, as MacArthur himself had promised, he would return. The strategy that had worked so effectively in the Southwest Pacific would soon be tested at a scale and intensity that even its architects had not fully anticipated, and that test would come not merely in the form of larger garrisons or stronger fortifications, though both of those things were true. It would come in the form of a fundamental question about what happens when an island has nowhere left to retreat, when its defenders have been ordered to hold at any cost, when the Japanese command structure had begun to fully comprehend what was happening and had started, with a kind of grim finality, to prepare for the final stands that would define the remainder of the war. Consider, for a moment, the psychological transformation that was occurring within the Japanese military during these middle months of 1944. Throughout the first 2 years of the war, Japan had seemed invincible. The initial victories had been so swift and overwhelming that many Japanese officers had believed they had established a defensive perimeter that could be held indefinitely. They had created what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and this sphere was supposed to be self-contained, defensible, impregnable. But now, as American forces began to appear with increasing regularity at islands they had considered secure, that vision was beginning to crumble. The Japanese Navy, which had once dominated the Pacific, was losing ships faster than it could replace them. The pilots who might have stemmed the tide of American advancement were being used up in combat, their experience and knowledge dying with them when they fell. And the garrison commanders on the outer islands, men like Inoue Masao at Ley and Kanji Ishizaki at various positions throughout the Bismarcks, were beginning to receive messages from Tokyo that conveyed an unmistakable sense of urgency, even of desperation, masked beneath the formal language of military communication. What was being asked of these commanders, in effect, was that they transform themselves from the guardians of an expanding empire into the custodians of a shrinking perimeter. Each island that fell was a wound, and while the wounds were being inflicted at the periphery, there was a growing awareness that the core itself would eventually be threatened. This knowledge, though it could not be openly acknowledged in official communications, permeated the culture and the decision-making of the Japanese High Command. The Americans, meanwhile, were discovering something that would become increasingly important as the campaign wore on. They were learning that the island-hopping strategy, for all its elegance and efficiency, required an almost unfathomable level of coordination and supply. Every amphibious landing depended on naval support. Naval support depended on fuel and ammunition and spare parts, all of which had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean. The longer the advance continued, the longer these supply lines became, and the more vulnerable they grew to Japanese counterattack. Yet MacArthur and his staff had already begun to develop solutions to these challenges, solutions that would become increasingly sophisticated as the campaign progressed. They were establishing depots on captured islands, creating supply caches that could support the next advance before it even began. They were coordinating with the Navy to ensure that logistics vessels arrived in concert with combat ships. They were, in effect, building an entire mobile infrastructure that moved forward with the tide of combat, that transformed captured atolls into forward bases almost as quickly as the Japanese defenders had been removed from them. One of the most remarkable aspects of this logistical achievement was how little attention it received, both at the time and in the historical record afterward. The campaigns themselves, the landings, the battles, the Japanese counterattacks, these were documented in newspapers and newsreels and official reports. But the patient, methodical work of moving thousands of tons of supplies across the ocean, of establishing depots, of coordinating the arrival of food and ammunition and medical supplies with the arrival of fighting men, this work happened largely out of sight, yet it was absolutely fundamental to the success of the entire enterprise. And as these supply lines lengthened and became more complex, they also became, in a strange and counterintuitive way, more resilient. Because the strategy of island hopping meant that you were no longer dependent on a single, fragile line of communication stretching back to the rear. You had multiple bases now, multiple ports, multiple opportunities to refuel and resupply. If one route became dangerous, you could use another. If one base was attacked, you had others nearby. The strategy was, in this sense, not just militarily sound but logistically elegant, a solution to a problem that conventional warfare would have found almost insoluble. As the campaigns of the Middle Pacific unfolded through the summer of 1944, it became increasingly clear that MacArthur's original intuition about how to wage war against Japan had been validated not just by events on the battlefield, but by the grinding reality of sustaining a war across vast distances and against an enemy that was still possessed of considerable strength and determination. The island-hopping strategy, with all its audacity and its apparent recklessness, had actually proven to be the most rational approach available, the one that maximized American advantages while minimizing American vulnerabilities. The momentum of Cartwheel was beginning to feel unstoppable by early 1944, and yet beneath the surface of those island victories, a quieter, more complex struggle was unfolding, one that had little to do with combat and everything to do with resources, logistics, and the vast web of supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Every soldier who landed on those distant shores, every piece of ammunition expended, every ounce of fuel burned in aircraft engines, had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was predominantly from the United States mainland, traveling across distances so immense that the mathematics of it all seemed almost impossible to contemplate. The question that haunted every supply officer and every quartermaster was always the same. Could the pipeline hold? Could America manufacture, transport, and deliver everything needed to sustain an ever-advancing front line, all while simultaneously maintaining operations in Europe, the Atlantic, and everywhere else American forces were engaged. MacArthur's staff had developed a system that was, for its time, remarkably sophisticated. They called it the Advanced Base System, and its architecture was deliberately designed to reduce the dependence on Hawaii and the main American depots that were thousands of miles away. Instead, as each island was captured, it would be transformed, sometimes within hours, into a refueling station, an ammunition dump, a repair facility, a hospital, a communications hub. Each location became a stepping stone that shortened the distance to the next objective, and in doing so, reduced the burden on the main supply chain. It was an elegant solution to an otherwise insurmountable problem, yet it was also fragile in ways that weren't always immediately visible. The capture of an island meant nothing if you couldn't hold it, defend it, resupply it, and the Japanese, though increasingly desperate, were acutely aware of this vulnerability. One of the most pressing concerns for MacArthur's planners was the question of interdiction, the threat of Japanese air attacks on these newly established supply bases. A single well-coordinated assault from Japanese aircraft could destroy months of accumulated supplies, or worse, interrupt the flow of reinforcements at a critical moment. This fear was not abstract or theoretical. It had been validated repeatedly throughout 1943 and into 1944. The solution, as it often was in warfare, involved a blend of offense and defense. Air superiority was the foundation of everything. The Americans had learned, sometimes painfully, that ground operations of any scale became vastly more difficult, more costly, and often impossible without the ability to control the skies above those islands. To achieve this, the Americans had developed a rotating system of fighter cover where squadrons would be based on forward airfields and would maintain constant patrols, ready to intercept any Japanese aircraft that ventured near American positions. Behind them came the heavier bombers, the B-17s and B-25s, which would strike at Japanese bases hundreds of miles away, preventing them from launching attacks in the first place. The technological aspect of this air campaign deserves a moment of reflection, because it reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare, even in those early years. The American aircraft produced during this period, the P-38 Lightning, the P-40 Warhawk, the P-47 Thunderbolt, were, in many respects, superior to their Japanese counterparts, but superiority in raw performance was only part of the equation. The real advantage lay in the system, the ability to manufacture these aircraft in vast numbers, to replace losses quickly, to keep pilots rotating through training so that experience was preserved rather than lost when a pilot was killed, and to maintain the infrastructure, spare parts, fuel, ammunition, maintenance facilities that kept these aircraft flying. The Japanese, by contrast, were locked in a grinding war of attrition that they could not win. Each pilot they lost represented experience and training that took months or years to replace. The Americans, meanwhile, rotated experienced pilots home after a certain number of missions, preserving their knowledge while simultaneously using them to train the next generation. It was a strategic approach that, over time, proved nearly impossible for the Japanese to counter, and it became increasingly evident as 1944 progressed. The build-up on the islands themselves followed patterns that might seem routine to those not trained in the complexities of military logistics, but which represented extraordinary feats of organization and planning. On each newly captured island, engineer battalions would work around the clock to expand existing airfields or construct new ones from scratch. They would clear jungle, blast coral reefs, lay perforated steel matting to create landing strips that could handle the constant flow of transport aircraft, bringing supplies, ammunition, equipment, and personnel. Meanwhile, other units would establish supply depots, organizing everything from food and fuel to medical supplies and replacement parts into carefully catalogued systems that allowed for rapid distribution. Hospital tents would be erected, communication networks established, defensive positions strengthened. Within a matter of days or weeks, what had been enemy-held territory would be transformed into a functioning American military installation capable of supporting not only itself, but also the next phase of the advance. By the spring of 1944, the geographic scope of Operation Cartwheel had expanded significantly, and the campaign had begun to take on what historians often refer to as a two-pronged character, though MacArthur's vision was always more nuanced than simple dichotomy would suggest. The primary axis of advance, moving through the Solomon Islands and then toward New Guinea, remained under MacArthur's direct command. But alongside this movement, and sometimes overlapping with it in ways that created both opportunities and frictions, was the Central Pacific Campaign under Admiral Nimitz, which had begun in November 1943 with the assault on the Gilbert Islands and would eventually lead to operations in the Marshall Islands and beyond. The two commanders, while nominally operating under overall Pacific strategy directives from Washington, maintained a certain degree of autonomy and sometimes pursued strategies that didn't always align perfectly with one another. This duality, or tension, depending on one's perspective, became one of the defining characteristics of the Pacific War, and it had implications for how resources were distributed, which islands were targeted, and ultimately, how quickly the war could be brought to a conclusion. The question of which commander's approach would prove more efficient, more economical in terms of American lives, and ultimately more effective in bringing the war to an end, was far from settled in 1944. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy, as it had evolved through Cartwheel, emphasized moving up the New Guinea coast and then westward through the Philippines, seeking to establish a land-based approach to the Japanese homeland and to liberate territories that had been under Japanese control. Nimitz's Central Pacific strategy, by contrast, sought to drive more directly across the Pacific Ocean, capturing key islands that would serve as bases for air operations against Japan, and eventually bring American forces within striking distance of the home islands themselves. The debates between these two commanders and their respective staffs were, at times, quite heated, and they reflected not only different strategic philosophies, but also different visions of how the war should end, and what the American position in the Pacific should look like in the post-war era. For now, however, both campaigns were advancing, and both were consuming enormous quantities of American resources, manpower, and material. The question of how long American industrial capacity could sustain this dual-front approach, even with the Atlantic War consuming significant resources as well, was something that troubled planners in Washington, though the answer was becoming increasingly clear as 1944 progressed. American industry was proving capable of meeting demands that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. By the autumn of 1943, the machinery of Cartwheel had begun to move with a kind of inexorable momentum, the sort that comes when a strategy has been tested and proven and refined through the friction of actual combat. MacArthur had moved his headquarters further forward, establishing himself at Port Moresby, closer to the action, closer to the decisions that would shape what came next. And what came next was both a continuation of what had already been set in motion and something subtly different, a widening of ambition that would begin to reshape the entire Pacific theater. The geography of the campaign had by now become almost familiar to those planning it, even if familiarity never quite erased the uncertainty. The Huon Peninsula, that strange finger of land jutting into the Bismarck Sea, had become a focal point. It was from here, in many ways, that the enemy could threaten the Allies' supply lines most effectively, and it was from here that the Allies could begin to build outward toward the Philippines. The peninsula represented something like a hinge upon which much of the southwestern Pacific seemed to turn. In September, an operation called Huon had begun, not the peninsular assault itself, but the seizure of Leh, the major town on the peninsula's eastern coast. This was to be accomplished, in part, through an amphibious landing near Finschhafen, a coastal settlement that would become a new base. But what made this operation particularly significant in the broader context of Cartwheel was the way it demonstrated how the strategy had evolved. The landings were not simply of the overnight infantry sort anymore. They were accompanied by increasingly sophisticated air support, by careful coordination between ground and naval forces, by an understanding that the isolation of a position could be nearly as deadly to the enemy as a direct assault. Consider for a moment what this evolution meant for the soldiers themselves, particularly those who would be the first to touch ground on unfamiliar beaches. In the early phases of Cartwheel, every landing had been an act of profound faith. Faith that intelligence about enemy positions was accurate enough, that the guns offshore would neutralize the right targets, that the men in the landing craft would find solid ground and not bog down in swamps or reefs that no map could fully represent. By autumn of 1943, that faith had been tested so many times that it had begun to calcify into something more like confidence, though confidence remained forever fragile in a combat zone. The Finschhafen landing took place on the 22nd of September, and it was executed with a precision that earlier operations could scarcely have managed. The men went ashore, met resistance that was heavy in places but not decisive, and began to establish a beachhead. Within days, the town itself fell to Australian forces, who had pushed inland with speed that surprised even the planners. The Japanese, it seemed, had been caught somewhat off balance. Their forces in the region stretched thin by the demands of multiple fronts, their supply lines beginning to show the strain of being regularly attacked from the air. Yet even as Ley fell and Finschhafen was secured, there was a deeper significance unfolding that few soldiers in the field could have fully grasped. MacArthur and his planners were already looking further afield. The Philippines remained the ultimate objective, the general's stated purpose, and, some whispered, his personal redemption after the humiliation of his forced departure in 1942. But between New Guinea and the Philippines lay thousands of miles of ocean, hundreds of islands, and numerous Japanese installations of varying but often formidable strength. This was where Cartwheel's brilliance and its underlying cruelty began to show itself more clearly. The strategy was not simply to fight from one location to the next in some kind of methodical progression, like a man climbing stairs. Instead, it involved the deliberate bypassing of strongly held positions, the isolation of enemy forces, and the cutting off of their supply lines until they withered on the vine, left behind as the campaign rolled forward. Certain islands would be taken, others would be attacked and rendered harmless. Still others would be left to garrison small numbers of troops who no longer served any meaningful purpose to the war's outcome. For the men left behind in these isolated positions, the experience must have been peculiar, perhaps even surreal. They had come to fight for the emperor, to hold territory, to participate in what they had been told was a great expansion of the co-prosperity sphere. Instead, many found themselves watching the war pass them by, watching the great powers commit their forces elsewhere, while smaller and smaller numbers of men rationed increasingly scarce supplies and waited for rescue or death, whichever came first. Some of these positions would hold out until the very end of the war, sometimes even after the emperor's surrender, their garrisons not receiving word that the fighting had ceased. The calculus of this strategy was brutal but efficient. It meant that Japanese troops could not be everywhere at once. They could not defend every position with the numbers necessary to mount a serious resistance. MacArthur's forces, for all their challenges and all their losses, could choose where to concentrate their strength, and in those chosen places, they could almost always achieve local superiority. The enemy was forced into the position of reacting to American movements rather than directing them, of being constantly off balance, never quite knowing where the next hammer blow would fall. By the final months of 1943, as the seasons shifted and the weather in the region grew more unpredictable, the pattern had become established. Operations would be planned months in advance, with meticulous attention paid to intelligence about enemy positions. Reconnaissance aircraft would fly repeated sorties over potential landing zones. Naval forces would be gathered and briefed. Air commanders would coordinate their strategies with ground commanders. And then, when all the pieces were finally assembled and the moment deemed right, The operation would unfold with a kind of orchestrated precision that reflected both the accumulated experience of those doing the planning and the extraordinary advances in amphibious warfare that had been made since the campaign's beginning. It was becoming clear to observers at the time, though perhaps not entirely clear, that the Pacific War was entering a new phase. The Japanese military, still formidable and still dangerous, had begun its slow transition from a force engaged in expansion to a force engaged in defense, and this shift, subtle though it might seem, represented a fundamental change in the nature of the conflict. The initiative, that precious and rarely relinquished advantage in warfare, had slipped away from Tokyo's grasp and into MacArthur's hands. The question that now hung over everything was not whether the Allies could win in the Pacific, but how far they could push, and at what cost, before the enemy either surrendered or was entirely destroyed. By the summer of 1943, the coral islands and jungle strongholds of the Southwest Pacific were beginning to reveal the true shape of MacArthur's grand design. What had started as desperate defense along the New Guinea coast had transformed into something far more deliberate, far more ambitious. The general had been refining his vision with each landing, each hard-won airfield, each bloody push forward. And now, as his forces consolidated control of the Central Solomons and prepared for what many believed would be the final thrust toward the Philippines, a quieter, but equally profound shift was occurring in how the war itself was being waged. The men who fought in these campaigns, the sailors who transported them, the pilots who flew overhead, many of them had begun to notice something almost rhythmic about the way the war was unfolding. Landings happened with increasing frequency, supply lines grew longer, more intricate, more dependent on precise timing and coordination. The Japanese, for their part, were beginning to understand that they were facing not random attacks, but a carefully orchestrated chess match, one in which their enemy seemed to know exactly which pieces mattered and which could be left behind to wither. This was perhaps the most subtle and yet most consequential aspect of the entire strategy. MacArthur's command was learning to think in terms of what military planners would later call economies of force. Rather than attacking every defended position, the American forces could identify which islands truly mattered to the larger calculus of war, which airfields were essential, which harbors were critical, which strongpoints, however well fortified, could be isolated and rendered harmless without a direct assault. The philosophy contained within these questions would eventually reshape how modern warfare itself was conceived. Consider, if you will, the position of Rabaul. This sprawling Japanese base on the northern tip of New Britain had seemed, to many observers, like the natural target for MacArthur's next hammer blow. It was one of the largest Japanese military installations in the entire theatre, a citadel of concrete and steel and volcanic rock overlooking the Bismarck Sea. Thousands upon thousands of troops were garrisoned there, thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies. If you were to ask a conventional military mind where the next offensive should strike, the answer would come almost immediately. Rabaul must fall. The logic was ancient and honorable. Confront the enemy's strength directly, defeat it in battle, seize the objective. But MacArthur, in the autumn of 1943, was thinking in a different register altogether. What if, he wondered with his staff, Rabaul did not need to be conquered? What if it could instead be bypassed, isolated, and allowed to become strategically irrelevant? His submarines and ships could cut off its supply lines. His aircraft could bomb it relentlessly from newly captured airfields at considerable distance. The Japanese garrison, surrounded and slowly starving, would become less of a threat with each passing week rather than an enemy to be defeated in battle. The manpower that would have been needed to assault Rabaul, the blood that would have been spilled on its beaches and in its jungles, could instead be directed toward the Philippines, toward even more distant objectives. The implications of this thinking were profound, though they unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, across the vast distances of the Pacific. It meant that the war would not proceed in a straight line from one objective to another. It would instead follow a path that was sometimes indirect, sometimes even counterintuitive. An island might be attacked, not because it was the enemy's stronghold, but because it had a suitable harbor or a plateau where aircraft could land. Another island, even if it held strategic value, might be left untouched if the cost in lives was deemed too high relative to the gain in territory. This represented a subtle but significant departure from the doctrine that had guided commanders throughout the centuries of warfare. Traditionally, armies sought battle where the enemy was strongest, tested their mettle against their opponent's most formidable defenses, and emerged victorious because of superior courage or tactics or resources. There was honor in that conception of warfare. There was also, of necessity, a great deal of bloodshed. What MacArthur and his growing circle of planners were developing was something closer to a calculus of strategic utility. Every island, every position, every piece of terrain could be assigned a value. That value was not purely military, not simply about how many guns it had or how well fortified it was. The value instead encompassed questions of logistics, of what contributions the position could make to the larger war effort, of how many men it would take to seize it, and how many lives might be saved by bypassing it altogether. The intelligence operations that supported this way of thinking were expanding as well. Signals intelligence, the interception and decryption of enemy radio communications, provided increasingly clear pictures of where Japanese strength actually lay and where it was weaker than it appeared. Photographic reconnaissance, conducted by intrepid pilots flying high-altitude missions in unarmed aircraft, revealed the disposition of airfields and installations with remarkable clarity. The human intelligence gathered from coast watchers and native scouts added texture and detail to the larger picture. By the latter months of 1943, MacArthur's command had begun to develop a more nuanced and accurate understanding of the Japanese presence throughout the Southwest Pacific than the Japanese themselves possessed about American intentions. This asymmetry of knowledge conferred an immense advantage, one that no amount of bravery or defensive fortification could entirely overcome. When MacArthur decided to attack, he did so with a clear sense of what he would face. When he decided to bypass a position, he did so with confidence that the decision would not leave his flanks exposed or his supply lines vulnerable. The Japanese, by contrast, operated increasingly in a fog of uncertainty. They knew that the Americans were moving forward. They did not always know where the next blow would fall. This meant that their resources, never as abundant as those available to the American war machine, were stretched across an ever-lengthening line of possible objectives. What emerged from this pattern, as autumn turned toward winter in 1943, was something that might be called a war of shadows and echoes. The dramatic battles, Guadalcanal in the south, the grinding campaigns on the coasts of New Guinea, remained very real and very deadly. But alongside these headline-grabbing operations, a more subtle form of attrition was taking place. Isolated garrisons learned that the supply convoys they depended upon were no longer coming through. Damaged ships that might once have been repaired and returned to service were lost because the Japanese shipyards that would have fixed them were themselves coming under attack or were isolated by the American advance. The Japanese Navy, already diminished by losses at earlier engagements, found fewer and fewer opportunities to engage the American fleet in a decisive battle because MacArthur's strategy was increasingly designed to avoid such confrontations when it was not advantageous to accept them. This is not to suggest that the warfare itself became less violent or less intense. Far from it. The landings on small islands that held little strategic value beyond their possession of suitable terrain could be extraordinarily bloody affairs. The jungle fighting that characterized so much of the New Guinea campaign was brutal and close and personal. But the overall momentum of the war, the way in which the Americans were moving from one position to another with increasing speed and confidence, took on a quality that was almost mechanical. Like gears in a vast engine, each operation fed into the next. Each landing created the preconditions for the landing that would follow. Each airfield brought the next objective within range of American aircraft. And in the headquarters where MacArthur worked, In the tents and command centers where his staff officers plotted and planned, there was growing confidence that this engine, once fully engaged, would carry the American forces all the way to the Philippines and beyond. The general himself grew increasingly certain, perhaps overly certain, that his strategy would succeed precisely because it seemed to him to embody a kind of logical inevitability. The Japanese, he believed, would eventually find themselves with no good options, their resources exhausted, their strategic situation hopeless. The momentum of Cartwheel had created something almost gravitational by the time the calendar turned toward late 1943. The string of atolls and jungle-fringed islands that MacArthur's forces had claimed weren't merely conquests on a map. They had become the architecture of an entirely new kind of warfare, one that required a recalibration of how modern navies and air forces might work in concert with ground troops operating across an ocean that suddenly felt less like a barrier and more like a highway. The question that had nagged at commanders in Washington, whether the island-hopping approach could actually sustain itself at this scale, was beginning to find its answer not in theory, but in the tonnage of supplies flowing through forward bases and the steady drum of aircraft engines warming up before dawn. By October of that year, the campaign had carried the Sixth Army and supporting forces to the point where they could begin to eye New Britain itself, one of the largest and most strategically important landmasses in the arc of islands that MacArthur had set as his path. And yet, even as the scope of the operation expanded, the fundamental rhythm of Cartwheel remained recognizable. Seize an airfield or two with limited forces, establish air superiority over the newly conquered territory, and then allow that airfield to become the springboard for the next leap forward. Each movement seemed to teach the planners something new, and each victory made the next phase feel somehow more achievable, even when intelligence reports suggested the opposition was hardening, becoming more desperate, more willing to convert each contested island into a final stand. It was during these months that the human cost of the strategy began to weigh more visibly on the minds of those who directed it from command posts in Brisbane and aboard flagship cruisers anchored in lagoons. The men doing the actual fighting, whether they were Marines wading through coral reefs or soldiers hacking through undergrowth in pursuit of Japanese positions, were bearing an accumulating exhaustion. Malaria had become as much an enemy as the soldiers dug into bunkers and pillboxes. Supply officers wrestled with the logistics of maintaining increasingly distant garrisons. Pilots flew mission after mission in heat and humidity that seemed to drain vitality almost as thoroughly as anti-aircraft fire. The clean strategic elegance of island hopping, when viewed from a distance, sometimes dissolved into something rawer and more morally ambiguous when one stood in the actual terrain where it was being executed. MacArthur himself remained largely distant from much of this granular reality, a figure more of mythology than constant presence. He communicated through dispatches and radio broadcasts, projecting confidence and decisiveness, and there is something to be said for the stabilizing effect of that projection. Soldiers take their emotional cues partly from their leaders, and MacArthur's unwavering conviction that the campaign would succeed, that the leap to Luzon would come, and that he would fulfill his famous vow to return to the Philippines, this became a kind of psychological anchor. Whether one views this as leadership genius or as a convenient distance from the actual machinery of human suffering probably depends somewhat on one's philosophical orientation. The Japanese, meanwhile, were facing something approaching a genuine strategic dilemma. The resources committed to defending the outer ring of their perimeter were enormous, yet the mobility and firepower of the American forces seemed almost to mock traditional linear defense. When the Japanese committed heavily to a particular island, MacArthur's forces often simply bypassed it, establishing air superiority around it and allowing it to become what military historians would later call a bypassed garrison, occupied still by Japanese soldiers, but militarily irrelevant, cut off from resupply, essentially quarantined by American air and naval power. It was a form of psychological and material strangulation that may have been less visible than a direct assault, but which accumulated effects as month followed month. There existed within the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army, it seems, an increasing recognition that the perimeter, as originally conceived, could not be held. Yet the orders from Tokyo continued to insist that each position be defended to the last soldier, that no ground be yielded without bleeding the Americans as profusely as possible. This divergence between strategic reality and command ideology created an almost tragic tension. Some Japanese officers, sensing the futility, began to wonder whether their duty to the emperor might be better served by a different kind of sacrifice, one that bought time for the homeland to prepare for the inevitable invasion that many knew was coming. Others clung more rigidly to the doctrine of absolute resistance. Both approaches, in their own way, were being tested by Cartwheel. The aerial dimension of the campaign had, by this midpoint, become almost staggeringly complex. American air superiority, while not absolute, had become so pronounced that Japanese pilots found themselves increasingly operating from forward airfields under conditions of extreme duress. The loss rate of experienced Japanese pilots had reached catastrophic levels. A pilot shot down over friendly territory could be recovered and returned to service, but one shot down over water or enemy-held terrain was simply gone. The American replacement system, by contrast, rotated pilots home after completing a set number of missions, allowing them to train the next generation and carry hard-won combat experience forward. This asymmetry in pilot replacement policies would, some argue, constitute one of the most underappreciated strategic victories of the entire war in the Pacific. You might wonder, in a quieter moment, whether victory in large campaigns is sometimes decided not by the most dramatic engagement, but by choices made in administrative offices about personnel rotation and training cycles. It is a peculiarly modern kind of warfare, one that would accelerate through the rest of the conflict. The distances involved in Cartwheel had also begun to reshape the technological demands on the American military. Aircraft needed longer range or more fuel-efficient designs. Ships required more sophisticated radar as they learned to fight in the cluttered waters of the archipelago, where islands rose suddenly from shallow reefs. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of open ocean, requiring constant vigilance against Japanese submarines and surface raiders. The logistical tale of Cartwheel grew ever longer and more complex, consuming resources at a rate that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, yet somehow, the American industrial machine kept pace, adjusting production schedules, sending more ships, more fuel, more ammunition through the pipelines that stretched back to the west coast, and ultimately to factories humming with civilian workers, converted into instruments of production for a distant war. And through all of this, the tactical adjustments, the logistical experiments, the accumulating weariness of men in combat, the Japanese recognition that their strategic options were narrowing, MacArthur's fundamental vision for Cartwheel remained largely consistent. Keep moving, keep pressing, don't allow the Japanese time to consolidate or reinforce. Let the mobility of the American forces and the reach of American air power do the work that might otherwise require frontal assault against prepared positions. It was a philosophy born partly from necessity, since the early American forces in the Southwest Pacific had never possessed the overwhelming numerical superiority that might have allowed a more direct approach. Yet by late 1943, it was becoming clear that even with growing resources, this philosophy had merit beyond mere necessity. It was proving effective, it was economizing lives, at least in comparison to the sort of island-by-island slugfest that earlier wars might have required. The movement toward New Britain, then, represented not so much a change in the fundamental strategy as an acceleration of it, a deepening commitment to the idea that MacArthur had championed from the beginning, and a growing confidence that the resources now flowing into the theatre could sustain an operation of this ambition for as long as it took to complete the arc and position his forces for that final leap northward. By the late months of 1943, as the island campaigns continued their methodical advance, MacArthur's headquarters had begun to perceive the true shape of the strategy that was unfolding across that vast and fragmented theatre. The island-hopping blueprint, as it had been refined through hard experience and desperate improvisation, was now moving through a phase of consolidation, not in the sense of pause or reflection, but rather in the deepening certainty that this approach would indeed be the pathway forward. The mathematics of amphibious warfare were becoming clearer with each operation, and the logistical networks that supported these advancing forces were growing more sophisticated, more resilient, and more capable of sustaining the rhythm of successive landings across greater and greater distances. One might ask what happens to a military machine when it begins, gradually, to believe in its own method. There is a subtle but profound shift that occurs. Not arrogance exactly, but a kind of steadying confidence that comes from repeated success, from learning the hard lessons of earlier campaigns and incorporating them into doctrine that feels, increasingly, inevitable. By this point, MacArthur's planners had conducted dozens of smaller operations, had refined their understanding of air support, had learned precisely how much artillery to position on captured beachheads before the next push, and had built relationships with naval commanders that, while sometimes strained by ego and competing visions, had matured into something workable and effective. The question that occupied strategic thinking at this stage was not whether the island-hopping approach would work, but rather how to accelerate it without overextending supply lines to the breaking point. This tension, between the desire to move faster and the cold reality of what logistics could sustain, became one of the defining preoccupations of the months ahead. The New Guinea campaign, with its dense jungles and difficult terrain, had shown that speed of advance was not merely a matter of will or tactical brilliance. Every mile of forward progress required more supplies, more ammunition, more food, more fuel. The ships that carried these materials had to be protected, maintained, sometimes replaced. The airfields that supported operations had to be constructed, fortified, and continuously improved. There was, in other words, a kind of steady-state calculation that had to be made at every step. Interestingly, this period also saw the emergence of what might be called a psychological dimension to the strategy. The soldiers and sailors who participated in Operation Cartwheel were not merely implementing a plan, they were living it, experiencing it, learning from it in ways that no amount of staff planning could fully anticipate. The amphibious assault techniques that had seemed so experimental in 1942 were becoming, by 1943 and into 1944, something closer to routine, though of course nothing involving combat and the proximity of death could ever truly become routine. Yet there was a professional confidence that developed, a sense among landing craft crews and assault troops and supporting units that they had learned how to do this thing, how to move across vast distances and conduct successful operations in an environment of extreme difficulty and persistent danger. The role of intelligence during this phase cannot be understated, though it is often overshadowed in popular narratives by the drama of the actual battles themselves. Reconnaissance, code-breaking, prisoner interrogation, and simple observation of enemy movements provided MacArthur's command with an increasingly clear picture of where Japanese forces were concentrated, where they were weakening, where they might be expected to make their stand. This information flowed into the planning process and shaped decisions about which targets to assault and which to bypass or isolate. The Japanese military, for all its tactical skill and the courage of its personnel, was operating under the handicap of radically diminishing access to reliable information about Allied movements and intentions. By contrast, the Allies were reading Japanese radio traffic with increasing success, were intercepting and decoding messages that revealed enemy dispositions and strategic thinking. One begins to see, through the lens of these middle months of the Cartwheel campaign, how asymmetry in information and logistics can gradually shift the balance of a struggle. The Japanese were fighting with extraordinary determination, inflicting heavy casualties, mounting fierce resistance at every landing site, but they were doing so with decreasing ability to predict where the next blow would fall, with supply lines that grew more tenuous with each passing month, with reinforcements that arrived too slowly and in insufficient numbers. The question they faced, and this was perhaps the deepest strategic challenge of their position, was how to maintain a defensive perimeter of thousands of miles when the enemy possessed the ability to choose where to fight, and could do so with growing air and naval superiority. MacArthur himself, during this period, was evolving in his thinking as well. The general who had proclaimed, "I shall return," and had initially envisioned a great confrontation with Japanese forces in the Philippines, was becoming, perhaps without fully acknowledging it, more and more a practitioner of the very kind of limited objective, persistent methodical strategy that the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington favored. Each successive operation was revealing the practical wisdom of moving carefully, of consolidating gains, of using superior resources to ensure success at each step, rather than gambling on grand maneuvers. There was something almost meditative about the process, though naturally nothing in warfare that involves the deaths of thousands can truly be described in such peaceful terms. The technological dimension of these operations continued to evolve as well. Landing craft were being modified, improved, made more reliable. Radio communications between ships and shore-fire control parties were becoming more sophisticated. Medical evacuation procedures were being refined, saving lives that would have been lost in earlier operations. The integration of naval gunfire support with ground operations was becoming smoother, more coordinated, more lethal to the enemy. All of these incremental improvements, multiplied across dozens of operations and hundreds of support activities, were having a cumulative effect that was difficult for any single observer to fully appreciate, but that was nonetheless very real and very consequential. And beneath all of this, beneath the strategy and the logistics and the tactical improvements, lay the human reality of individual soldiers and sailors confronting danger, making decisions in moments of crisis, enduring the physical and psychological strain of amphibious operations in tropical heat and humidity. These young men, many of them barely out of their teens or in their early 20s, were participating in something that would, in retrospect, be recognized as one of the most significant military campaigns of the war. But they could not have known that then. They knew only that they had been trained for this, that they had comrades depending on them, and that success in their particular task, whatever it might be, contributed to the larger design that MacArthur and his planners were executing across the scattered islands and waters of the Southwest Pacific. The island of Bougainville itself presented MacArthur with a puzzle unlike any he had faced before, not because the terrain was uniquely forbidding, though it certainly was, but because the Japanese had learned. They had learned what happened at Guadalcanal. They had learned what it meant to be outflanked, to have supply lines severed, to find themselves abandoned on an island with no hope of reinforcement. And so when the Americans began their approach to Bougainville in the autumn of 1943, the Japanese commander there, General Masatane Kanda, made a choice that would echo across the rest of the campaign. He would not, as convention might dictate, concentrate his forces on the beaches. He would not repeat the errors of those who came before him. Instead, he would pull his men inland, into the jungle's dense and suffocating embrace, where American naval gunfire and air superiority meant far less. This was a fundamental shift in Japanese thinking, and it meant that when the first American landing craft touched sand on Bougainville's western shore near a place called Cape Torokina in early November, the resistance they encountered was puzzlingly light. MacArthur's commanders wondered, in those first hours, whether they had stumbled into a trap, whether the Japanese were massing in the interior, gathering strength for a counteroffensive that would come crashing down upon them once they had committed men and materiel to the beachhead. The reconnaissance patrols moved cautiously inland, their boots finding coral-cut paths and then fading tracks that led deeper into a world of shadow and green. What they discovered was something closer to truth. The Japanese were indeed waiting, but not in a way that earlier American generals might have predicted. General Hyakutake, the commander of the broader 17th Army, had issued orders that suggested a new military philosophy altogether. Rather than fighting for every inch of ground immediately, they would trade space for time. They would allow the Americans to establish their foothold. They would let them build their airfields, extend their runways, dig in their artillery. And then, when the moment felt right, when the Americans had become comfortable in their positions, believing themselves safe on an island supposedly secure, the Japanese would strike from the interior, from those jungle strongholds, from positions the enemy had never properly reconnoitered or understood. This waiting strategy represented something MacArthur had not truly confronted before, an enemy that had adapted not just tactically but philosophically. The Japanese military hierarchy had been forced, through repeated defeats, to acknowledge certain realities. They could not win in conventional open battle. They could not match American industrial capacity or the speed at which American factories could replace ships, planes, and soldiers. But what they might do was make the campaign as costly as possible. What they might achieve was to inflict such heavy casualties that American public opinion, already weary of this distant war, might turn against further prosecution of the Pacific campaign. It was a strategy born of desperation, yes, but also of calculation, and it would shape how the fighting on Bougainville unfolded in the weeks and months ahead. The American beachhead at Cape Torrequina grew with remarkable speed. Transport ships were unloaded day and night, heavy equipment rumbled off the landing craft and into the muddy interior. Engineers began work almost immediately on what would become Piva Airfield, a facility that would eventually host hundreds of American aircraft. The soldiers who came ashore were exhausted from the transport ships, from the tension of wondering what would greet them, but they were also disciplined. They understood that this was the Pacific way now. You landed, you dug in. You prepared for an enemy counteroffensive that would come when you least expected it, or perhaps not come at all, which was somehow worse because the uncertainty never lifted. What happened in those early days on Bougainville, though, began to demonstrate something subtle about how thoroughly the American amphibious learning curve had progressed. The coordination between naval gunfire support, Marine and Army assault troops, and air cover was almost seamless. When Japanese positions were detected, when sniper fire or mortar rounds came from the jungle edge, American artillery responded with a speed that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The supply chain that kept ammunition flowing, that ensured the fighting men had food and water and replacement weapons, operated with a smoothness that reflected months of accumulated experience across dozens of islands. This was not the fumbling, desperate landing of Guadalcanal. This was the mature expression of American amphibious warfare doctrine, refined by trial and error and the accumulated wisdom of thousands of men who had learned what worked and what did not. But MacArthur, observing from his command post, understood something that the planners in Washington might not have fully grasped. Every month that passed, every island that was captured or bypassed, every Japanese garrison left stranded without resupply, every airfield that came online and extended American air power further westward toward the Philippines, represented not just military progress, but political momentum. The American public was beginning to see victories. Newsreels showed American flags raised over captured territory. Casualty figures, while still grim, were beginning to show a trend. American losses were being replaced. Japanese losses were not. The casualty asymmetry that would eventually decide the Pacific War was already becoming visible to those who knew how to read the numbers. The fighting at Bougainville itself, once the Japanese finally committed to their waiting strategy and launched their inland counteroffensives, proved to be among the most brutal and least celebrated of the entire campaign. There were no grand maneuvers to speak of, no brilliant tactical deployments that would later fill the pages of military histories. Instead, there was grinding, day-to-day combat in terrain that seemed designed to nullify every advantage an invader might possess. Jungle rot infected the feet of men who had to wade through swamps. Malaria claimed more soldiers than Japanese bullets. The humidity was suffocating enough to make breathing itself feel like labor, and yet, somehow, the American lines held. Day after day, the perimeter expanded slightly. The Japanese counteroffensive, when it came in substantial force, achieved some temporary successes, but ultimately failed to dislodge the Americans. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Japanese had no air superiority, no ability to resupply their forward positions by sea, no hope of outside reinforcement. They were fighting on an island they could not hold, and gradually, the men in the American lines began to understand this. The enemy was not going to drive them into the sea. The enemy was simply going to lose, slowly, at terrible cost to both sides, but inexorably. What remains perhaps most striking, when examining the Bougainville campaign as one moment within the larger Operation Cartwheel strategy, is how thoroughly it illustrated the logic of island hopping as MacArthur had conceived it. The goal was never to eliminate every Japanese soldier. It was never to fight for every piece of territory until the enemy had surrendered or been destroyed completely. The goal, rather, was to seize terrain that provided strategic advantage, that offered airfields, that extended the range of American power, that allowed for the next forward movement toward the ultimate objective. Bougainville, for all its suffering and its terrible cost, was primarily valuable because it moved the American air umbrella closer to the Philippines. It allowed for the establishment of air bases that could reach into New Britain, into other Japanese-held territory, and eventually into the Philippines themselves. From a MacArthur strategic perspective, the island's secondary value, what happened to the Japanese garrison left behind, how thoroughly the American lines dominated the interior, was far less significant than its primary value. It was a stepping stone, exactly as planned. The grinding momentum of Cartwheel had produced something extraordinary by the middle of 1944, a rhythm of conquest that was beginning to feel almost predictable, though predictability in wartime often conceals the most fragile moments. MacArthur's forces, having rolled up the coast of New Guinea and into the Bismarcks, now faced a peculiar strategic question that had been germinating beneath the surface of their victories: how to manage the very speed of their own success. The Japanese, pressed back across thousands of miles of ocean, were consolidating their remaining strength into island bastions that grew progressively more isolated, more desperate, more dangerous, precisely because they had nowhere left to retreat. And it was in this context that the operations around the Marianas and toward the Philippines took on a character quite different from what had come before. The distances involved in these middle stages of the campaign had begun to strain even MacArthur's logistical apparatus, which had proven so brilliantly flexible in the earlier island-by-island advances. When your supply lines stretch across hundreds of miles of open ocean, vulnerable to submarine attack and weather alike, even victory becomes a precarious affair. The general understood this with perhaps greater clarity than his competitors in the Pacific hierarchy. The Navy's other commanders, Nimitz chief among them, were operating under different constraints and possibilities, their fleet-centered approach allowing them to leapfrog across the vast distances in ways that MacArthur's ground forces could only approximate through careful positioning and timing. And so there arose, subtly but persistently, a tension in the strategic conversation. MacArthur was pushing toward the Philippines with what might be called a deliberate certainty, but his approach meant moving more slowly in some respects than the raw distance would suggest, because each step had to be assured before the next could begin. Consider the position of Biak, a modest island in the Schouten Group, which the Allies assaulted in late May of 1944. To the strategist studying a map, Biak appeared to be simply another stepping stone, another conquered piece of geography on the way to larger objectives. But for the soldiers who landed there, and for the Japanese garrison who had been ordered to hold it as a fortress, it became something far more consequential, a battle of attrition in which terrain, supply, and human endurance collided. The Japanese had embedded themselves in cave systems and fortified positions that took weeks to reduce, longer than many had expected. And this, perhaps, was emblematic of the new phase into which Cartwheel was entering. The early lightning advances through relatively lightly held territory were giving way to grinding contests for islands, that had been turned into strongholds, where every captured position had to be consolidated, every airfield had to be secured, before the next movement could commence. The relationship between MacArthur and his own subordinate commanders grew more complex in these months as well. General Walter Kruger, who commanded the Sixth Army and served as MacArthur's principal executor of the amphibious operations, was an officer of remarkable competence, yet the two men did not always see eye to eye on tactics and timing. MacArthur had certain visions of how quickly the campaign could move, visions informed as much by political urgency as by military calculation. The general harbored ambitions regarding the liberation of the Philippines that went beyond the purely strategic. There was something personal in his determination to return to Manila, something tied to his sense of honor and his public promise made years earlier when he had been forced to withdraw from those islands. This personal element, while it may have motivated magnificent courage and determination, sometimes created friction with those whose primary concern was the efficient movement of troops and the preservation of life. The intelligence picture in mid-1944 presented a landscape both encouraging and troubling. The Allies had begun to understand, through captured documents and interrogations, and the increasingly desperate radio traffic of the Japanese, that the enemy's position in the Southwest Pacific was becoming untenable. Supply ships that had been sent to reinforce garrisons were being sunk before they arrived. Aircraft that were meant to defend the outer islands often never reached their destinations. The Japanese military machine, which had seemed so formidable at the war's beginning, was being systematically dismantled through the combined pressures of isolation, attrition, and the mounting industrial capacity of American production. And yet, and this was the thought that sobered even the most optimistic planners, an enemy under such pressure becomes more unpredictable, more willing to fight to the last man, more capable of inflicting terrible casualties in the process of losing. What did it mean, strategically speaking, to be advancing toward victory while simultaneously knowing that the cost of that final victory was rising with every mile? This was the unspoken question that hung over the meetings and planning sessions of MacArthur's headquarters in these middle months of the campaign. The mathematics of modern warfare at that scale were becoming clearer. You could measure success in territory gained, in enemy ships sunk, in casualties inflicted. But you could also measure it in American lives spent, in supply ships committed, in the time that might be needed elsewhere, as pressure mounted in Europe, and as Japan's final defenses drew closer. The beautiful clarity of the island-hopping concept, moving up the line, bypassing strong points, leapfrogging toward the heart of Japanese power, had revealed itself to have hidden complexities, layers of decision-making that required weighing things that could never be fully quantified. The movements toward the Palau Islands, which took place in mid-September of 1944, represented perhaps the culmination of this phase of Cartwheel. These were no longer lightly held outposts. The Japanese had poured resources into fortifying Peleliu and Angar, knowing that these islands guarded the final approaches to the Philippines. The battle for Peleliu, in particular, became one of the bloodiest per square mile in the entire Pacific campaign, a grinding, brutal affair that seemed to many participants to exceed any reasonable strategic justification. The question of whether Peleliu needed to be taken at all has haunted military historians ever since. Some argue it was captured for no clear purpose, that it could have been bypassed, that its conquest added nothing to the ultimate victory but took something immeasurable from those who fought there. Others defend its capture as necessary to secure supply routes and prevent Japanese interference with future operations. The truth, as so often happens in the complexities of real warfare, likely contains elements of both perspectives, obscured by the fog of decision-making in real time, with incomplete information and conflicting priorities. By the late summer of 1944, then, Cartwheel had transformed from a campaign of relatively swift advances into something more akin to a grinding confrontation with the heart of Japanese resistance. The lightness of touch, the brilliance of the early movements, the sense that MacArthur's genius was allowing the Allies to win on the cheap, all of this had been replaced by a recognition that reaching the Philippines was going to be an affair of immense cost and extended commitment. The supply lines stretched further, the distances grew longer, the enemy's desperation increased, with every island that fell into Allied hands. Yet the momentum remained, the operational brilliance that had carried the campaign forward was still evident in the planning and execution of these later moves, and the overall strategy of driving toward the Philippines remained sound, even as its human costs grew more apparent with every passing week. By the autumn of 1943, the machinery of Cartwheel had begun to settle into a rhythm of its own, a clockwork pattern of assaults and consolidations that was fundamentally altering the balance of power across the entire South Pacific. The Japanese, who had once seemed unstoppable in their sweep across Southeast Asia, now found themselves on an entirely different kind of defensive. Not the catastrophic, all-hands-to-battle defensive of a surprised enemy, but something far more insidious and grinding, a slow compression of their strategic space that left them with fewer and fewer choices about where to stand their ground. And it was during this period, as the year turned toward winter, that MacArthur and his planners began to confront a question that had haunted military strategists since the beginning of warfare itself. When you begin to circle an opponent, when you start to cut off their room to maneuver, how do you know which islands matter most, and which ones you can afford to simply bypass? The concept that would come to define the later phases of Cartwheel, and indeed, the entire remaining Pacific campaign, was something that air power, increasingly, had made possible. It was called the Siege Island, or, more candidly in planning rooms and in officers' bars, the bypassed garrison. The idea was deceptively simple, though its execution required a kind of confidence that many commanders before MacArthur had lacked. If you could establish air superiority, that is, if you could own the skies above a Japanese-held position, then you could simply leave that position behind without attacking it directly. The garrison would be cut off, their supply lines severed, their reinforcements made impossible. Slowly, inevitably, they would weaken and eventually surrender, or be left to die in isolation. You didn't have to assault every mountain, every coastal fortress, every entrenched position. You could leave them burning in your wake, while your main force pressed forward toward objectives that mattered more strategically. This was not a new idea, precisely. Naval blockades had worked this way for centuries, but the addition of aircraft, particularly the ability to establish air supremacy over vast distances, made it workable on a scale that would have seemed impossible in any earlier conflict. And it meant that MacArthur could move faster, could strike more audaciously, could concentrate his forces on points of real strategic value rather than dissipating them across the archipelago in a wasteful campaign of attrition. The implications were profound, even if they took time to fully percolate through military thinking. New Britain, for instance, that large and strategically significant island that sat like a barrier across the path to the Philippines, had been a question mark in MacArthur's plans. The Japanese had substantial garrisons there, particularly at the western end of the island, and conventional wisdom suggested that it would need to be invaded and subdued before the campaign could truly advance. But as 1943 drew toward its close, the thinking began to shift. What if New Britain didn't need to be conquered outright? What if air bases established on nearby islands, and particularly on New Guinea, could be used to neutralize Japanese strength there, to render the island's garrisons powerless without a single soldier needing to wade ashore? The appeal was obvious, and increasingly, MacArthur's planners began to think in these terms. At the same time, there was another factor that had begun to assume greater importance in the calculus of the campaign, something that had perhaps been underestimated in the initial planning phases. The actual logistics of amphibious warfare, the extraordinary complexity of moving men, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and all the 1,000 other necessities across open ocean to beachheads that were often hostile and poorly charted, had proven even more demanding than the pre-war estimates suggested. Every landing required enormous quantities of shipping, both for the assault itself and for the sustained supply operations that would follow. Ships had to be protected, routes had to be cleared of submarines, and every day that a vessel spent moving men and materiel to the Pacific was a day it couldn't be doing something else elsewhere. This created a kind of mathematical tension in MacArthur's calculations. He could move faster if he could reduce the size of his assaults, if he could choose his targets more carefully, if he could concentrate force at decisive points rather than spreading it thinly across many operations. But this also meant that he had to be very precise about which islands mattered and which ones could be left to wither on the vine. Get this wrong, and you could find yourself with an unsecured flank, with Japanese reinforcements suddenly flowing into an area you thought you had neutralized, with the whole operation grinding to a halt while you dealt with a threat you had thought you had safely bypassed. The debates among his staff during the latter months of 1943 often turned on this question of which islands were truly vital and which were merely obstacles. There was, one might say, an emerging philosophy of calculated abandonment, though not everyone was comfortable with it. The more conservative-minded among his subordinates worried that leaving Japanese garrisons behind, no matter how isolated they might be, represented an unacceptable risk. What if the Japanese attempted a desperate counteroffensive? What if supplies somehow got through? What if those garrisons, though isolated, could still somehow affect operations conducted elsewhere? These were not unreasonable concerns, even if they sometimes missed the larger strategic picture that MacArthur was trying to develop. But MacArthur himself seemed increasingly confident in his grasp of what was possible. The intelligence reports flowing in from various sources, from coast watchers, from captured documents, from signals intelligence that was becoming ever more sophisticated, painted a picture of a Japanese military stretched thin, losing the initiative, increasingly forced to react to American moves rather than shaping events independently. If this was true, and if air superiority could genuinely isolate bypassed garrisons, then the fastest path to victory might indeed be the one that seemed to move most directly north, that accepted risk in exchange for speed, that focused resources on the truly important objectives rather than spending them on every strong point in the Japanese defensive system. What this meant, in practical terms, was a series of decisions that would define the next phase of Cartwheel and that would, arguably, set the template for how the entire remaining Pacific War would be fought. Each island group that approached MacArthur's forces would now face a judgment of sorts, a cold strategic assessment of whether it needed to be attacked and held, or whether it could be neutralized from a distance and left behind. Some Japanese commanders would find themselves learning, often to their horror, that they had been bypassed, that the Americans had left them behind and pressed forward without bothering to assault their positions directly. It was a form of psychological warfare as much as it was a military technique, because it suggested a kind of contempt for their strength, an assertion by MacArthur that his opponent's garrisons were simply not important enough to bother fighting. And as the autumn turned toward winter, as the season shifted and weather patterns across the Pacific began to move in new directions, these decisions about which islands to strike and which to leave behind began to be made with increasing regularity. The rhythm of Cartwheel was becoming more assured, more confident, more focused. The campaign, which had begun as a somewhat improvised operation launched under conditions of uncertainty and limited resources, was maturing into something larger and more ambitious. The Philippines, which had seemed impossibly distant only months earlier, were beginning to seem, not inevitable perhaps, but at least within the realm of genuine possibility, something that could be reached if the campaign maintained its momentum and if the decisions about which islands to accept and which to bypass were made with clear-eyed precision. The question that haunted MacArthur's war room as 1944 drew toward its midpoint was not whether the Allies could win, but at what cost they would seize each successive island. By the summer months, the pace of the campaign had begun to reveal a troubling pattern, one that officers in Brisbane and senior commanders in Washington were beginning to openly debate. The island-hopping strategy had indeed shortened the war's duration considerably, yet each landing seemed to demand a steeper payment in lives, both American and Japanese, than the previous one. The defenders had learned. They had watched the pattern of the American assault, studied the methods of the beach landings, observed how naval gunfire was orchestrated and how air support was coordinated, and they adapted. Intelligence reports flowing into MacArthur's headquarters spoke of Japanese fortifications becoming more sophisticated, more deeply entrenched. The engineers who had survived earlier campaigns were now constructing better bunkers, positioning artillery with greater precision, and creating interlocking fields of fire that made the simple frontal assaults of 1943 increasingly untenable. The human cost of capturing Saipan in June and July of 1944 had shocked even hardened combat veterans. Nearly 4,000 American servicemen had fallen on that single island. The Japanese had resisted with a fanaticism that suggested, at least to some observers, that surrender would never be an option. There were reports, fragmentary and difficult to verify, but deeply disturbing nonetheless, of Japanese civilians throwing themselves from cliffs rather than accept capture, a phenomenon that would recur and intensify as the island war crept closer to the Japanese home islands themselves. MacArthur understood that momentum alone would not carry the campaign forward indefinitely. Resources were finite. Supplies had to be transported thousands of miles across an ocean, still contested by Japanese submarines. The fleet needed time to resupply, to repair damaged vessels, to rotate exhausted crews, and yet the operational calendar allowed no comfortable pauses. Once an island had been secured, the airfields had to be expanded, the supply dumps established, the next objective prepared for assault. The rhythm of war admitted no intermission. Those who commanded at the operational level understood this intimate tension between the need for rest and the relentless pressure of events unfolding across the vast theater of the Pacific. There was also a dimension of Cartwheel that, while never explicitly stated in official documents, colored nearly every decision that moved down the chain of command. The campaign was, in a very real sense, a competition. General Douglas MacArthur was not the only senior commander shaping American strategy in the Pacific. To the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded a parallel thrust that involved different islands, different objectives, and, perhaps most significantly from MacArthur's perspective, a different naval force structure. Between MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area and Nimitz's Central Pacific Command existed a rivalry that was professional in its outward manifestations, but deeply personal in its underlying currents. Both men were performing for an audience in Washington. Both were aware that the eventual assault on Japan itself would likely be commanded by one general or the other, not both. This unspoken competition influenced how aggressively each officer pressed his campaign, how quickly islands were assaulted, how much risk was deemed acceptable in pursuit of the next objective. By mid-1944, MacArthur had already orchestrated the capture of the Marianas. Palau was being prepared as the next target, and eyes were turning toward the Philippines themselves. The promise he had made at Corregidor, to return, had evolved from a poetic aspiration into a concrete operational objective. And the pathway to that objective ran directly through the logic of Cartwheel. Skip the heavily defended islands where Japanese forces were most concentrated, establish footholds on less defended positions, build up air and naval supremacy through those positions, and gradually constrict the ring around the Japanese homeland. Yet what must have occupied MacArthur's thoughts during those long Brisbane evenings was the unresolved question of what would happen when the campaign reached its logical conclusion, when the island-hopping strategy had expended all the islands that could be skipped, when the geography of the Western Pacific no longer permitted the luxury of bypassing enemy strongholds. What then? The nature of warfare would necessarily transform. At some point, the careful calculus that had allowed him to reduce losses through maneuver and position would give way to something far more direct and terrible. The mathematics of invasion, of actually trying to seize and hold the home islands of Japan itself, were of an entirely different order. They suggested casualties that would dwarf anything yet experienced, even in the bloodiest campaigns thus far. This may be why, in the documents and memoirs that emerge from this period, there is a subtle shift in how MacArthur spoke about the endgame. The confidence never wavered. Indeed, his public pronouncements grew, if anything, more forceful about ultimate victory. But those closest to him detected an awareness that the pristine elegance of Cartwheel's logic would eventually collide with the immovable facts of geography and Japanese resolve. The island-hopping strategy was not an answer to the fundamental problem of how to defeat Japan. It was, rather, a brilliant and costly way to approach that problem while minimizing certain categories of loss. But it could only postpone, not eliminate, the harder questions that lay ahead. When we look back across those vast stretches of water and time, across the island chains where young men pressed forward under an unforgiving sun, Operation Cartwheel emerges not as a moment frozen in history, but as something more like a turning point that rippled outward in ways those planning officers in their map-filled headquarters could never have fully imagined. The strategy itself, this deliberate, calculated method of leapfrogging through archipelagos rather than meeting the enemy everywhere, would echo far beyond the Second World War and into the very architecture of modern military thinking. There is something almost poignant about how MacArthur's grand ambition, born partly from ego and partly from genuine tactical insight, found itself vindicated not by the ease of its execution, but by the sheer determination of the men who carried it forward. The soldiers themselves, those infantry privates and young officers who waded ashore on island after island, rarely understood the larger geometric pattern their sacrifice was tracing across the map. They knew only the immediate weight of their rifles, the heat, the chaos of landing craft grinding against coral reefs, the faces of the men beside them. Yet in some profound way, they were writing the closing chapters of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. What emerges from studying Cartwheel, if we allow ourselves to sit with it for a moment, is a paradox that defines much of military history itself. The collision between vast, impersonal strategic plans and the fiercely personal reality of individuals experiencing them. Generals move units across maps as though arranging chess pieces, speaking in the language of maneuver and objective and logistics. But each unit represents thousands of human beings, each with their own fears, loves, uncertainties about whether they would return home. The gap between those two versions of war, the one drawn in colored pencil on acetate overlays, and the one lived in mud and blood, and the acrid smell of cordite, contains something that no amount of historical analysis can fully bridge. The technological dimensions of Cartwheel also deserve a moment's gentle reflection. The operation unfolded during a period of extraordinary innovation in amphibious warfare and air power. New landing craft designs, improved radio communications, refined understandings of naval gunfire support. These accumulated small improvements created the foundation for increasingly ambitious operations. One might say, if one were inclined towards such speculation, that Cartwheel represented a kind of coming-of-age moment for modern amphibious operations, a proof that massive coordinated assaults across great distances had moved from the realm of desperate improvisation into something more like systematic doctrine. What would Gallipoli's planners have given for the experience and equipment available to the Cartwheel commanders? Yet, for all its strategic clarity and operational innovation, Operation Cartwheel came at a cost that extended far beyond the casualty lists, significant as those were. The war in the Pacific, even as Cartwheel progressed, consumed resources that might have been directed elsewhere. The very success of the island-hopping approach created its own momentum, its own demand for more men, more ships, more supplies. There is a rhythm to war, once it begins, that becomes almost self-perpetuating. Each victory creates the conditions for the next campaign. Each sacrifice demands that the cause be vindicated by further progress. In this sense, Cartwheel was both a triumph of strategic clarity and a testament to the strange gravity that military operations possess once they are set in motion. The human cost, naturally, rippled backward across the Pacific to homes in the American Midwest and South and Northeast. Mothers received telegrams. Sweethearts received letters bearing dates from places they'd never heard of. The Cartwheel campaigns were won in jungles and on beaches, yes, but they were also fought in the hearts and households of people waiting for word, hoping for letters, struggling to comprehend distances they could barely imagine. This invisible front, this home front of worry and faith and quiet endurance, was every bit as real as the military one, and it too deserves remembrance when we reflect on what these operations meant. What perhaps lingers most strongly, though, as the mind settles into consideration of Cartwheel, is the question of inevitability. When we trace these historical paths backward from their conclusions, when we see how island followed island in the sequence MacArthur had envisioned, it can seem as though the outcome was foreordained, that Japanese defeat was simply a matter of time and American logistics. But this vision obscures something important. At every point along the way, the operation required specific decisions by specific people, carried out under conditions of uncertainty and risk. The commanders who ordered these assaults had no guarantee of success. The soldiers who executed them faced genuine possibility of death or disfigurement. The farther one looks into the granular details, the more contingent history becomes. Small decisions compounded, small acts of courage or presence of mind turned moments. Small technological advantages accumulated into larger strategic superiority. Nothing in this history was inevitable until after it had happened. And perhaps that is the most restful thought to carry into quieter hours of the night. This understanding that even vast historical movements are woven together from countless individual choices and moments. It reminds us that human agency, while operating within constraints and within systems larger than any individual, never entirely disappears. Even in the mechanized horror of modern warfare, in the scale and scope of operation that Cartwheel represented, the decisions and actions of individuals still mattered. Leaders still led. Soldiers still chose how they would respond to fear. The human dimension persists, even when we speak in numbers and strategy and grand movements across maps. The Pacific War continued for nearly a year and a half after Cartwheel's nominal conclusion, and it would demand still more from those same divisions and fleets and commanders who had proven themselves in the earlier campaign. But the foundation had been laid, the template had been established, and somewhere in the calculus of those overlapping campaigns, Cartwheel and its successors, the war's ultimate outcome was becoming increasingly clear to those with eyes to see it. Not certain, never quite